dark room, sometime in 1992. A mixing board glows, and a man sits in front of it with a problem that has no clean answer. His name is Gary Rydstrom, and he has been asked to build the voice of a Tyrannosaurus rex. There is a difficulty at the centre of the task, quiet and absolute. He has no reference audio, none exists. No microphone has ever been held up to the animal he is trying to conjure, because the animal has been gone for tens of millions of years. So he does what a sound designer does when the world hands him a silence. He goes looking among the living. He gathers recordings of animals that are here, breathing, that can be captured on tape. And then he begins to stack them, one over another, until something enormous seems to rise out of the speakers. Stay here with him for a moment, in that studio, before we go anywhere near the ancient world. Because the sound being assembled in this room is about to teach a whole generation what a dinosaur sounds like, and almost none of it will be true. The base layer, the thing that gives the roar its throat, comes from a baby elephant. Rydstrom recorded it at the San Francisco Zoo, a young animal trumpeting, and he slowed that trumpet down and pitched it low. On top of that he laid the snarl of a tiger, the front edge of aggression, the part that makes your skin tighten. Underneath he set the bellow of an alligator, a sound with real weight, a rumble that seems to come up through the floor. He folded in the growl of a koala, which is a strange and guttural noise, far deeper than the small animal has any right to make. And for the exhale, the great shuddering breath at the end of the call, he used the sound of a killer whale clearing its blowhole. Count them. 5 living animals, none of them a dinosaur, pressed together into a single voice. A baby elephant, a tiger, an alligator, a koala, a killer whale. Not one of them shares a throat with the creature on the screen. The roar is a collage, layer on layer, like pressing 5 different wet handprints into the same patch of wet sand until the shapes overlap and you can no longer tell whose hand was whose. That mix became the sound. It rolled out of theatres in 1993, and it settled into the imagination of everyone who heard it, and it never really left. When you picture a Tyrannosaurus rex now, you almost certainly hear that roar. The head thrown back, the teeth, the wall of noise that seems to shake the seats. It is one of the most convincing sounds ever built, and it is a construction, an invention made by a talented person under deadline, with no dinosaur behind it at all. Now let the studio go quiet, and let us put a real animal in its place, so you can feel the size of what that roar was standing in for. Tyrannosaurus rex was large in a way that is hard to hold in the mind. The biggest individuals reached something close to 40 feet, from snout to tail tip. Lay that out along the ground, and it is longer than a school bus. The mass estimates for the largest of them climb toward 9 tons, which is more than a fully loaded delivery truck carried on 2 legs. The skull alone was around 5 feet long. The jaw, if you could set it down in front of you and open it, would be long enough to lie down inside, a bone corridor of banana-sized teeth, with your whole body fitting between the tips. These animals walk the floodplains of western North America near the very end of the age of dinosaurs. Their bones come mostly from the Hell Creek Formation and the rocks that share its age, laid down roughly 68 to 66 million years ago. That is the closing chapter of the Cretaceous, the last few million years before the world changed. Warm, humid country, slow rivers braiding across broad plains, conifers and ferns and the newer flowering plants filling in the green. Somewhere out there, Triceratops. Somewhere out there, Edmontosaurus. And moving among them, the largest land predator the continent had yet produced. We know a great deal about this animal. We can weigh it more or less. We can measure the force of its bite from the marks it left on other bones. We can trace the growth of a single individual across its life from the rings inside its bones. We can say where it lived and roughly when and what it likely ate. The science here is real and hard won. built from thousands of specimens and a century of patient work. But of the sound it made, we have nothing direct, not a whisper. Here is the honest problem stated plainly, because it is the hinge the entire subject turns on. No larynx has ever been recovered from a Tyrannosaurus rex. No syrinx, the specialized voice organ of birds, has ever been found in it. No preserved vocal tract of any kind, no fossil throat, no trace of the soft machinery that would have shaped a call. These are structures made of cartilage and muscle and thin membrane. They are among the first things to rot, the first to vanish, long before the bones settle into stone. So the famous roar is not a reconstruction of evidence, it is an invention, a beautiful one, but an invention standing exactly where the evidence is missing. This is the strange gap at the heart of the topic. We can tell you the animal's weight to within a reasonable range, and we cannot tell you from any direct fossil whether it roared, boomed, hissed, cooed, or made almost no sound at all. The picture is loud in the theatre and silent in the rock, and that silence is worth sitting inside for a while, because it is where the real question lives. If not that roar, then what? If the sound in the movie was assembled from an elephant and a tiger and a whale with no dinosaur underneath, then what did the actual animal do when it opened that enormous mouth? And harder still, the question that seems almost impossible on its face: how could anyone ever know? How do you recover a sound from a creature that has been silent for 66 million years, when the very organ that made the sound turned to nothing before the burial was complete? Keep that question in your mind and keep the movie roar there beside it, because the roar is useful now. Treat it as a control case, a known quantity, a sound we can name every ingredient of because a person listed them for us. Whenever the real evidence starts to come in, you can hold it up against that studio collage and ask a simple thing: is this closer to the animal or closer to the elephant and the tiger? That comparison will do a lot of quiet work for you as we go. It helps to understand why the odds are stacked so heavily against ever hearing a dinosaur. Sound is made of moving air, shaped by soft parts. The column of air comes up from the lungs. It is set vibrating by some valve or membrane in the throat. Then it is filtered and coloured by shape of the passages it moves through, the length of the neck, the volume of any chamber it passes across, the opening at the end. In a living animal you can see all of this. In a fossil, almost every piece of it is exactly the kind of tissue that does not survive. Cartilage collapses, muscle liquefies, membranes are gone within days. What remains, if you are extraordinarily lucky, is bone, and bone is mostly silent about the soft organ it once supported. So for most of the history of studying dinosaurs, the sound was simply left blank, not answered wrongly, left blank, and into that blank, understandably, the culture poured the roar. It is easy to see why. A giant predator ought to be loud. Loudness feels like power, and power feels like the animal we imagine. The elephant gave it a throat, the tiger gave it teeth in the sound, the alligator gave it the low weight, and the whole thing felt right. It filled the silence with something the audience already believed. But feeling right and being right are different animals, and the difference is the whole game here. Consider what we are actually asking when we ask what a dinosaur sounded like. We are asking about behaviour, and behaviour almost never fossilises on its own. A footprint can catch a moment of movement, a bite mark can catch a moment of feeding, a clutch of eggs can catch a moment of care. But a sound leaves nothing behind in the sediment. It travels out, it fades, and it is gone the instant it is made. There is no layer of rock anywhere on Earth with a Cretaceous roar pressed into it. The event that we most want to recover is the one event that leaves the least trace of all, and yet the situation is not hopeless. This is the turn that makes the whole subject worth your evening. Because while the sound itself is gone, the machinery that shaped the sound sometimes leaves clues that do survive. Not the soft valve usually, but the hard architecture around it. The chambers, the tubes, the bony spaces where air once moved. And beyond the fossils there are the living relatives, the animals that still carry, in their throats and their behaviour, echoes of the group the dinosaurs belong to. That is where honesty and imagination finally get to work together, carefully, with the guardrails up. Think about the elephant one more time, the baby elephant whose trumpet became the foundation of the roar. It is a telling choice, and not only because it sounds impressive. Large modern animals do interesting things with sound that have nothing to do with roaring. Elephants produce deep rumbles, some of them so low that a human standing nearby feels them in the chest more than hears them in the ear. These low calls travel enormous distances across open country, far further than a high sharp sound would carry. For a big animal spread thin across a wide landscape, low and slow is often the language that works. It is possible that the most honest thing about the movie roar is the elephant at the bottom of it, and not for the reason anyone intended. There is a real thread of research suggesting that large dinosaurs were built to live in that low register. The clue is in the ear. The inner ear preserves, in bone, a structure whose length is tied to the range of frequencies an animal is tuned to hear. Comparisons across the archosaurs, the great group that contains crocodiles, birds, and all the dinosaurs, suggest that big-bodied dinosaurs were likely well suited to detecting low-frequency sound, possibly down into the infrasonic range that sits at or below the edge of human hearing. That is an inference drawn from anatomy, not a recording, and it should be held as such. But it points somewhere interesting. It suggests these animals may have lived in a soundscape closer to the elephant's rumble than the tiger's snarl. Notice what has happened, though. We have not gained a single second of Tyrannosaurus audio. We have only found a reason to doubt the roar and a direction to look instead. That is the honest shape of this whole field. It moves not by recording the past, but by narrowing what the past could plausibly have been, one careful constraint at a time. Before we go further, one small thing, since you are still awake enough to hear it. If these slow walks through deep time are the kind of thing you like to fall asleep to, the quiet company of real science told without any hurry, then let the channel know in whatever small way you can. It genuinely helps these long episodes find the people who are looking for exactly this. That is all. We now return to the silence and the animal standing inside it. Let us be precise about what the roar gets wrong, because the wrongness is instructive. A roar, in the modern sense, is a mammal thing. It comes out of a mammalian larynx, a voice box with vocal folds that can be driven hard and loud, and it is the signature of lions and tigers and bears, animals on a completely different branch of life from the dinosaurs. When Rydstrom reached for a tiger's snarl, he reached across an enormous evolutionary distance, borrowing the throat of a cat to voice a creature that was, in the deepest sense, far closer to a bird or a crocodile than to any cat. The dinosaurs were archosaurs, their living descendants are the birds, their living cousins are the crocodilians, and neither birds nor crocodiles roar the way a big cat does, because neither has the throat for it. So the very category of the movie sound may be off, not too loud or too soft, but the wrong kind of sound entirely, drawn from the wrong branch of the tree of life. It is a little like being handed a photograph of a stranger and told it is your great-great-grandfather. The face is a face. It is simply not the right one. What, then, do the right relatives sound like? Hold that thought lightly for now, because the living archosaurs will have a great deal to say later, and they do not say it with the roars. They say it with booms and hisses and deep closed mouth rumbles and honks and infrasound you feel through the ground. The palette is stranger and quieter and, in its way, far more interesting than anything a mixing board reached for in 1992. There is something almost tender in realizing this. The animal we have made into a monster of noise may have been, in truth, an animal of low sounds and long silences, a creature that rumbled rather than screamed, that signalled across the floodplain in a register you would feel in your breastbone before you understood you were hearing anything. We do not know this for certain, and no honest account will tell you we do, but it is a possibility the fossils gently allow, and the roar firmly does not. You can see now why the studio scene is the right place to begin. It is the perfect illustration of the whole trap. A silence in the record, a cultural expectation of loudness, a skilled hand filling the silence with borrowed voices, and then, over years, that filled in guess hardening into something that feels like knowledge, until people are sure they know what a dinosaur sounded like, when what they actually know is what a baby elephant sounds like when you slow it down and stack a whale's breath on top. None of this is a criticism of the sound itself. As a piece of craft it is remarkable, and it did exactly what it was built to do. The criticism, if there is one, is only of the quiet slide from invention into belief, the way a well-made guess can wear the costume of a fact for 30 years and never be questioned. The remedy is not to sneer at the roar. The remedy is to know precisely what it is. A control case, a known collage, a useful thing to measure the real evidence against. And there is real evidence. That is the promise this subject can actually keep. Not a recording, never a recording, but genuine physical clues sitting in museum drawers and inside CT scanners that let researchers say careful, bounded, honest things about the sounds these animals could have made. A preserved throat bone from an armoured dinosaur, the first of its kind ever found. The oldest known voice organ of any bird, pulled from Antarctic rock. Hollow crests in duck-billed dinosaurs that behave, when modelled, like the tubing of a wind instrument. And a living laboratory of birds and crocodilians whose throats still carry the group's deep grammar. Each of these has a number attached, a date, a specimen, a named researcher who did the work. That is what keeps the whole enterprise on the right side of the line between science and imagination. When you can point to a specimen number and a publication year, you're no longer simply telling a good tale in the dark. You're reporting something the world actually contains. But we are not there yet, and the not being there yet is the point of beginning here. Right now, tonight, at the opening of all this, you have exactly one sound in your head, and it is a false one. The roar. The elephant and the tiger and the alligator and the koala and the whale, pressed into one voice under a deadline. It is worth naming that falseness clearly and without drama, the way you would gently correct a small thing a friend had always believed, so that everything that follows can be built on cleaner ground. Let the theatre lights come up for a moment, just in your mind. See the room for what it is. A person, a mixing board, a shelf of recordings of the living animals, and a screen with a creature on it that no one has ever heard. That is the true scene behind the roar, not a window into the Cretaceous, a very good piece of studio craft filling a silence that the fossils, on their own, refuse to fill. The silence is real. The silence is the honest starting condition of this entire subject, and it deserves your respect more than any roar does. Because it is only by taking the silence seriously, by refusing to paper over it with a borrowed voice, that anyone has ever managed to say a single trustworthy thing about the sounds of the ancient world. So set the movie down now, gently, the way you would set down a book you have finished. Keep it nearby. You will want it as a measuring stick. But stop mistaking it for a memory of something real, because it never was. What remains, once the studio goes dark, is a genuine question and a genuine method for chasing it. The question is old and simple and a little haunting. What did they sound like, these animals, when they called to a mate across the floodplain, or warned a rival off, or answered their own young? The method is newer and quieter and far more disciplined than any mixing board. It does not begin with the sound at all. It begins with the only things the animals actually left behind. Set yourself down on a riverbank in what will one day be northern New Mexico, roughly 76 million years ago. The rock that records this evening carries a name, the Kirtland Formation, laid down across the San Juan Basin grain by grain. None of it is stone yet. It is mud and sand and rotting leaves, still warm from the day. You're standing on a floodplain in the Lake Campanian, and the light is going long and low across the water. The rivers here are slow. They wander in wide brown loops between banks of ferns, dropping their silt in sheets when the rains come. This is a seasonally monsoonal world, wet for part of the year and drier for the rest, and you have arrived in the wet season. The channels are full. The air above them is heavy in a way you can feel on the backs of your hands, thick and close, holding the day's heat long after the sun has begun to sink. Feel the monsoon air settle onto your skin. It comes down like a warm, wet cloth draped across your shoulders, not cold, not clammy, just present, a weight of moisture that never quite lifts. Your breath does not cool you here. The humidity closes the gap between your body and everything around it, so the temperature of the leaves and the temperature of your arm feel almost the same. Look at what grows. Tall conifers stand in loose ranks along the higher ground, their trunks straight, their crowns dark against a bruised evening sky. Below them, the ferns spread in soft green banks, waist-high, unrolling new fronds at their tips. And threaded among all of it, low and modest, the early flowering plants, angiosperms still finding their place in the world, small blooms and broad soft leaves that will one day inherit the planet. This is not a jungle. It is open in patches, semi-wooded, with long sight lines between the tree stands and the water. That openness matters more than it seems, because openness is a property of sound. In terrain like this, with room between the trees and a heavy blanket of humid air overhead, a low sound can travel a very long way. A high sound cannot. High frequencies scatter off leaves and trunks and dissolve into the warm air within a few 100 feet. Low frequencies bend around obstacles, roll along the ground, and carry across open floodplain from one animal to another far out of sight. If you were built to be heard across this landscape, you would be built to speak low. Something is built exactly that way, and it is walking near the water. Parasaurolophus tubicin, a duck-billed dinosaur, a lambeosaurin hadrosaur, browsing the fern banks in the failing light. Stand near one and take its measure. From the broad flat snout to the tip of the tail it runs somewhere between 33 and 36 feet, longer than a city bus. It carries between 5,500 and 8,800 pounds, as much as a small truck, balanced over strong hind legs that can drop to all fours to feed. Its head is unmistakable. A long hollow crest sweeps back off the skull, about 4.5 feet from base to tip, curving like a swept-back horn. That crest is the reason paleontologists think this animal had a voice worth listening for. Inside it, the nasal passages loop up and back and down again before reaching the throat, a folded column of air held in bone. Sound needs a resonating space to gain body and depth, and here is a resonating space carried on the head of a 4-ton herbivore. Nobody has ever heard it used. What we have is the shape of the pipe, and the physics of what a pipe that size filled with warm, moist air would tend to do. It would tend toward the low register, toward a sound you would feel in your chest before your ears fully caught it. So let the evening fill with that possibility rather than certainty. Out across the fern flats, a large adult lets a call roll out of the folded chambers in its crest, a deep resonant note pitched down near the floor of your hearing, maybe lower. The sound does not crack or shriek. It moves like weather. It rolls across the open ground, bends around the conifer trunks, and reaches another animal grazing 1/2 mile off that you cannot even see. That distant one lifts its head. In the heavy air at that pitch, the message crosses the whole floodplain almost undiminished, while the small wet sounds of chewing and stepping vanish within a stone's throw. This is the quiet logic of the place. The medium chooses the message. Humid, heavy air favours the long, low note. Open floodplain rewards the animal that can throw sound past the tree line. A herd spread across acres of river bottom feeding with their heads down in the ferns would not need to see one another to stay together. They would only need to hear the low rolling contact call carry and answer it, and keep the group loosely stitched across ground too broad to watch. Now stand still and let the other senses fill in around the sound, because the air is not only carrying calls, it is carrying smell. Wet vegetation dominates everything. the green-bruised scent of trodden ferns, the resin sharpness of conifer sap, the sweetish rot of leaves breaking down in standing water. Mud gives up its own heavy smell as the day's warmth leaves it. When one of the great hadrosaurs shifts its feet, you catch the churned bank underneath, black and rich and faintly sour. There is no dust here in the wet season. Every breath you take is loaded with water and the green weight of a living floodplain. The light is nearly gone now. Look how it lies flat across the channels, turning the slow water the colour of old brass. The undersides of the conifer crowns hold the last of the glow while the fern banks below have already sunk into blue shadow. Insects lift off the water in slow columns. The heat of the day releases from the ground and rises to meet the settling damp of the evening, and for a while the whole floodplain seems to hang in a single held breath of warmth, neither cooling nor still fully warm. Here is where honesty has to walk beside the scene, quietly, without breaking it. You're standing inside a reconstruction. Every part of this evening was assembled, not witnessed. The conifers and ferns and small flowers come from plant fossils and pollen pressed into the Kirtland sediments. The slow wandering rivers come from the way that sediment was sorted and layered. Fine silt over channel sand, the signature of water that rose and fell with the seasons. The heat and the humidity come from the chemistry of the rock and the latitude of this land 76 million years ago. It is a careful portrait built from stone. It is not a photograph, and it is certainly not a sound recording. That last point is the hardest one to sit with, and the most important. The air itself left no trace. Sound is a passing pressure in a medium that vanished long before anything could preserve it. No layer of rock in the San Juan Basin holds the actual note a Parasaurolophus made on an evening like this. What survives is the instrument, the folded crest, the shape of the throat, the ears of the animals that might have listened. From those we can reason toward the kind of sound this world would favour. We cannot lift the sound back out of the ground, and so the evening stays half silent to us, on purpose, out of respect for what we do not have. You can stand on this bank as long as you like. You can feel the wet cloth of the air on your shoulders and smell the crushed ferns, and watch the brass light drain off the water. You can even watch the big crested head rise from the greenery and see the throat work. But the note that rolls out of it reaches you only as inference, a shape of a sound rather than the sound, carried on physics rather than on any preserved voice. Large animals like these were almost certainly listeners as much as speakers. Across the archosaurs, the reptile line that holds crocodiles and birds and every dinosaur between them, big bodies tend to come with inner ears tuned toward the low end, well suited to catching deep sound and perhaps the infrasound below the floor of human hearing, near 20 cycles a second and under. That is an inference too, read from the anatomy of the ear rather than any test of a living dinosaur, but it fits the world you're standing in. A floodplain that rewards low calls would also, over time, reward the ears best able to hear them, out past the tree line, across the wandering rivers, through the heavy dusk air. Let the scene go dim now. The conifers are black shapes. The water still holds a thread of light and then loses it. Somewhere out in the dark, the deep contact notes may still be rolling between animals you can no longer see, keeping the herd loosely gathered through the warm, wet night. Or the floodplain may have fallen quiet. You cannot know. You were never meant to hear it directly, and that is the truthful edge of every scene like this one. The habitat you can rebuild in fine detail, the exact air pressure of a single call, the timbre, the loudness, the meaning, all of that stayed in the vanished air. This is why the temptation to simply play the sound in your head, to let the movie roar or the movie moan fill the silence, has to be set gently aside. The floodplain gives you the medium. It gives you the shape of the instrument and the reach of the terrain, and the tuning of the ears. It does not hand you a recording, and no honest account will pretend that it does. To hear them honestly, you have to switch off the theatre and follow the only 3 trails the fossils ever leave behind. To hear them honestly, You have to switch off the theatre and follow the only 3 trails the fossils ever leave behind. It helps to understand, first, why there are only 3. It helps to know why the ground gives up so little of a voice. Think about what a voice actually is inside the body of an animal. It is not a bone. It is a column of moving air shaped by soft parts that flex and swell and tighten. In a living dinosaur, the sound began somewhere deep in the throat, in a sleeve of cartilage and a knot of muscle. Cartilage is not stone. Muscle is not stone. They are wet, pliable tissues built to bend and heal in a warm body, and built without meaning to be to rot. So picture the animal at the moment it dies, on a floodplain 75 million years ago. The heart stops, the lungs empty a last time, and the throat, that intricate instrument of cartilage and muscle and thin membrane, begins almost at once to come apart. Bacteria bloom, scavengers pull, water and heat go to work on the softest structures first. The larynx, the trachea, the fine sheets of tissue that tremble to make a call, these are among the earliest things to disappear. Here is the cruelty of it, told plainly. Bone can take a very long time to mineralize, to soak up minerals from groundwater and turn slowly toward rock. That process can run for thousands of years while the sediment holds the skeleton still. But soft throat tissue does not have thousands of years. It has days, sometimes hours. It vanishes the way warm breath vanishes off a cold pane of glass, there and clouding for a heartbeat, then simply gone, with nothing left to say it was ever there. The voice box does not fossilize because the voice box is usually rotted away long before the bone has even begun to think about becoming stone. That is the reason the fossil record of dinosaur sound is so nearly silent. Not because these animals were mute, almost certainly they were not, but because the very organ that made the noise was the first part of them to leave. You can find a hip bone the size of a door frame. You can find teeth, claws, whole articulated skeletons curled in the sand. And still, for more than a century of digging, no one had found the throat. So the science does not chase the voice directly. It cannot. Instead, it follows 3 trails, 3 kinds of evidence that survive when the soft parts do not. Each one is indirect. Each one is a way of asking the question sideways, of listening around the silence rather than into it. And when you lay all 3 beside each other, a rough shape begins to emerge, a sense of what these animals could and could not have done with air. The first trail is the one that surprises people most, because it is not soft tissue at all. It is bone, and bone survives. Some dinosaurs carried the resonating chamber of their own voices built into their skulls as hollow, rigid geometry. When that geometry is made of bone, it can fossilize, and what fossilizes can be measured, scanned, and modelled long after the flesh is gone. The clearest example wore its instrument on its head. The Lambeosaurine hadrosaurs were duck-billed dinosaurs, big plant-eaters of the late Cretaceous floodplains, and many of them grew strange hollow crests off the tops of their skulls. Not solid horns. Hollow ones threaded through the inside with looping tubes of nasal passage. In one of them, Parasaurolophus tubercen, that backward-sweeping crest ran roughly 4.5 feet long, a curved bony pipe as long as a grown person is tall, rising off the back of the head and folding the animal's airway into a long internal loop. Think about what that means for a moment, lying there in the dark. The air this animal breathed did not travel in a straight short line from nostril to lung. It was routed up and back through more than 4 feet of curving bone, then down again, a detour with no obvious purpose for simple breathing. But it has an obvious purpose if you know anything about music. A long, folded, hollow tube is the basic recipe for a wind instrument. It is the shape inside a trumpet, a horn, a trombone. Blow air through a bent pipe of the right length, and the pipe itself decides which pitches ring and which die away. This is why the crest is such a gift to science. The soft voice box may be gone, but the bony resonating chamber is right there, preserved as rigid geometry, its loops and bends frozen exactly as they were in life. You do not have to guess at the shape of it. You can scan it, slice by slice, and rebuild the hollow inside as a precise three-dimensional model. And once you have the shape of the tube, physics can tell you, within limits, what frequencies that tube would favour, what notes it would want to sing. That work has a long lineage, and it keeps being revised as the tools sharpen. Back in 1981, the paleontologist David Weiss-Hampel published an acoustic analysis of these lambeosaurine crests in the journal Paleobiology, treating the internal nasal passages as resonating chambers. He proposed something tender, something almost domestic. He suggested the big adults would have called at low frequencies, deep sounds suited to their long tubes, while the smaller juveniles with their shorter crests would have called higher, which raises the quiet possibility of vocal recognition between parent and offspring. A large low voice and a small high one, answering each other across the ferns. Then the modelling got literal. Researchers took a real fossil Parasaurolophus tubicin crest and ran it through a medical CT scanner, capturing hundreds of thin cross-sections spaced only about 1/8 of an inch apart, the same way a scanner would image a living patient, except this patient had been dead for 75 million years. From those slices they rebuilt the geometry of the looping internal tubes and fed it into a computer designed to model the acoustics of a musical instrument, treating the ancient bone the way an engineer would treat the bore of a trombone. What came out of the speakers was not a movie monster. It was a deep, low, resonating sound that could shift in pitch, and the team proposed that each individual animal, with its own slightly different crest, might have carried its own distinguishable voice. The work did not stop there, because good science keeps checking itself. In 2024, the acoustic researcher Hongjun Lin built a physical tube model of the Parasaurolophus crest and presented the results at a meeting of the Acoustical Society of America. And the physical model found something the earlier, simpler versions had missed. There were more internal chambers inside the crest than the plain trombone loop picture had assumed. The resonance function held up. The animal really did carry a wind instrument in its skull, but the exact shape of that instrument turned out to be more complicated than anyone had first drawn, a reminder of how partial this knowledge still is. And that is the honest edge of this first trail, the part worth saying slowly. No soft tissue survives for Parasaurolophus. There is no fossil larynx, no preserved trachea, no scrap of the muscle that would have driven the air. Everything about the timbre, the loudness, the precise call, is inferred from the bone and the physics, modelled rather than recorded. It is even still debated whether these crests were mainly for sound at all, or mainly a visual signal, a shape to be seen across a herd, or both at once. What the bone gives you is the resonating chamber. What it does not give you is the animal actually using it. You are reading the horn and imagining the player. There is a second trail, and for most of the history of this science it was the emptiest of the three. This is the trail of the voice box itself, the actual throat hardware, fossilized in place. For well over 100 years of collecting dinosaurs, this trail led nowhere. The soft larynx rotted away every time, exactly as we said, vanishing off the record like breath off glass. To hope for a preserved dinosaur voice box was, for generations, to hope for almost nothing. It was the kind of find people did not seriously expect to make, and yet very recently that trail stopped being empty. Something was found in the Gobi that no one had ever seen before in a dinosaur that was not a bird, a small set of throat bones sitting almost exactly where you would look for a voice. It is one of the strangest and most quietly important fossils in this whole account, and it waits a little further down the path. Hold the thought of it. A throat that survived when throats never survive. Before we walk down to it, take one slow breath in the dark and let the middle of the night settle around you. If these calm walks through deep time are the kind of thing you want more of, you can follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Nothing else is needed from you tonight. You can let your eyes stay closed and simply keep listening. Now the third trail, which is different in kind from the first two. The first trail read a bone. The second will read a rare fossil throat. But the third does not read any single fossil at all. It reads the living world. Because two branches of these animals are still here, still breathing, still calling, right now, in the marshes and the forests of the present day. To understand the trick of it, you have to know where dinosaurs sit on the tree of life. Dinosaurs belong to a larger group called the archosaurs, the ruling reptiles, and that group has exactly two surviving lineages. On one side, the birds, on the other, the crocodilians, the alligators and crocodiles and their kin. Every bird alive is a living dinosaur, a direct descendant of the theropod line. Every crocodile is the dinosaur's closest living cousin outside of birds, and here is the useful part. All the extinct non-avian dinosaurs, every Parasaurolophus, and every armoured Pinacosaurus and every great Tyrannosaur sit on the tree between those two living branches. That geometry gives scientists a powerful tool, and it has a name. It is called the phylogenetic bracket. The logic is simple enough to hold as you drift. If you want to know something about an extinct animal that left no direct evidence, you look at its two nearest living relatives, the ones that bracket it on the family tree. If both of those living groups share a trait, then the extinct animal in the middle very likely had it too, because the trait was probably inherited from a common ancestor of all three. Birds do it. Crocodilians do it. So the dinosaur standing between them, in all likelihood, did it as well. So the researchers go and listen to the living bracket, and they listen carefully. On the crocodilian side, the male American alligator gives one of the most astonishing displays in the animal world. He produces a deep bellow, and the bellow is preceded by infrasound. Sound so low it sits at or below the bottom edge of human hearing. You feel it before you understand it. And there is a detail in that bellow that matters for dinosaurs. The spacing of the resonant frequencies inside the call, what acousticians call the formants, reliably signals the animal's body size to other alligators. The sound carries honest information. A bigger body makes a lower, more widely spaced call, and other alligators can read that size straight out of the air. On the bird side, the range of what living dinosaurs can do with air is enormous, but one behavior matters most for the giants of the past. It is called closed-mouth vocalization. Instead of opening the mouth and calling outward, the animal keeps its beak shut and pushes the sound into an inflatable pouch in the throat, or the esophagus, so the call booms out through the resonating body rather than the open mouth. You have heard versions of this without naming it. The soft, deep coo of a dove is a closed-mouth sound. The booming of a large ground bird is another. The researcher Tobias Reed and colleagues showed in 2016 that this closed-mouth behavior has evolved independently at least 16 separate times within birds, and they estimated the probability that the common ancestor of all archosaurs already used it at around 42%. Not a certainty, but far from nothing. There is a further clue folded into that work, and it points the same way the crests do. Closed-mouth calling is only used by birds roughly dove-sized or larger, never by the tiny ones, and the physics of a closed resonating pouch favours low-frequency sound. Big body, low boom. Listen to a living example and it becomes vivid. The southern cassowary, a heavy flightless bird of the rainforest, produces booming calls with components down to around 32 Hz, and the dwarf cassowary reaches down near 23 Hz, both grazing the edge of infrasound, the whole body of the bird working as a resonating amplifier. The bird tilts its head toward the ground and shudders, and the sound comes out felt as much as heard. Now hold the two ends of the bracket together in your mind. On one side, alligators that bellow in infrasound and broadcast their size through the pitch of it. On the other, big birds that boom with closed mouths deep and low, their whole frames ringing. Both living branches of the archosaurs, the two that bracket every extinct dinosaur, lean toward the same thing: deep sound, low frequency, resonance through the body, Booms and coos and rumbles rather than the open-throated scream of a big cat, and that, quietly, is what the third trail suggests about the animals in the middle, not proof. The bracket is an inference, a way of reasoning about what the fossils will not directly show. But it is a disciplined inference, built from living anatomy rather than imagination, and it keeps pointing away from the movie roar and towards something lower, closer to a rumble you would feel in your chest across a floodplain. The Tyrannosaur's actual voice box has never been found, so any specific claim about how a Tyrannosaur sounded is an extrapolation from its relatives and from the shape of its inner ear, not a settled fact. That honesty is the whole discipline. The bracket does not hand you a recording, it hands you a probability, and it asks you to hold it lightly. There is even a hint that the giants were built to listen in that same deep register. Studies of the inner ear across archosaurs, comparing the length of a structure called the basilar membrane, suggest that large-bodied dinosaurs were well suited to hearing low-frequency and possibly infrasonic sound in the same broad way that large modern animals like elephants are. If the big dinosaurs were tuned to hear low sound is a reasonable guess for what they made. A world of animals speaking below the floor of your own hearing, calling to each other in a register you would sense in the ground more than the air. So those are the three trails, and it is worth setting them side by side one last time before we follow the first of them down into the strangeness. The first trail is bone made into an instrument, the hollow resonating chambers you can scan and model, most spectacularly the looping crests of the hadrosaurs. The second trail is the rarest thing of all, the fossilized voice box itself, absent for a century and then, against every expectation, found. The third trail is the living bracket, the birds and the crocodilians, whose shared deep voices let researchers reason toward what the animals between them likely could and could not do. None of the three on its own is going to hand you a dinosaur's true voice, and even together they're not going to give you a recording, because no recording of a living dinosaur will ever exist. What they give you instead is a convergence, three independent lines from three completely different kinds of evidence, all leaning away from Hollywood and toward the low, the resonant, the felt. In the long silence of the fossil record, that convergence is not a mere geological instant of luck. It is the closest thing to hearing them we are ever likely to get, and it is the honest ground the rest of this account will stand on. That is the shape of the search, and the tools that make it possible. Everything that follows is really just these three trails, walked slowly, one at a time, until the sounds begin to gather in the dark. We will start where the evidence is most solid, where the instrument is not soft tissue at all, but bone you can hold in your hands. Picture the machine first, because the machine is where the voice begins. In Albuquerque, in the year 1997, a fossil crest rests on the bed of a medical CT scanner. It belonged to Parasaurolophus tubicine, a duck-billed dinosaur that browsed the floodplains of what is now New Mexico around 75 million years ago. The crest is a hollow tube of bone, roughly 4.5 feet long, sweeping back and up off the top of the skull. Inside it, the animal's nasal passages once looped in on themselves like plumbing folded to save space. A paleontologist named Tom Williamson and a computer scientist named Carl Diegert lower it into the scanner the same careful way a technician lowers in a living patient. Except this patient has been dead for 75 million years. It will not flinch, it will not breathe, it will never hold still or fail to hold still, because it stopped doing either a very long time ago. The scanner does something quietly strange. It does not photograph the crest from the outside. It reads straight through it, slice by slice, in flat cross-sections. Each slice is a single thin plane, a map of where there is bone and where there is empty air. The team captures 350 of these slices, spaced 3 millimeters apart, about 1/8 of an inch between one and the next. Think of each slice as a page. Now think of all 350 pages stacked in order, one just behind another, The whole thickness of the crest turned into a book you could hold. If you set your thumb against the edge and riffled it, the way you riffle a fat paperback and watch the corner blur, you would be travelling the entire length of the crest from front to back in a second or two. That riffle, slowed down and held still, is what the computer sees. On its own, a stack of slices is only a portrait of hollow space. The next step is where the voice starts to gather. The team stitches the slices back together into a single three-dimensional shape. Not a shape of the bone exactly, but of the emptiness the bone wrapped around. The looping air canal that ran up into the crest and back down again becomes a solid ghost of itself, a cast made of numbers rather than plaster. And here the reconstruction makes its key move. It stops treating that hollow as an animal's nose and starts treating it as the inside of a musical instrument. An acoustician studying a trombone does not care much about the brass. What matters is the bore, the exact volume and shape of the air column running through it, because the shape of the air is what decides the note. So the model takes the crest's interior and asks the same question you would ask of any pipe or horn. If you drove air through this particular geometry, what frequencies would it want to sing? You already know the feeling this describes, even if you have never named it. Take an empty glass bottle and draw a slow breath across its mouth. The air catches, and after a moment a low round note swells up out of the neck, a tone you feel buzzing faintly on your lips before you fully hear it. Blow across a taller bottle and the note drops. Fill it part way and the note climbs. Nothing about the glass changed, only the length and shape of the air column inside it. A resonating crest works on that same physics, scaled up to something the size of a fire hose bent double inside a bony hood. When the Sandia team ran the numbers, the speakers did not produce a roar. What came out was low and long and resonant, a droning sort of moan that could bend and shift in pitch. The researchers went a step further and suggested the exact shape of each animal's crest would tune it a little differently, so that one Parasaurolophus might be told from another by voice alone, the way you know a familiar person calling from the next room before you see them. Now hold one word very firmly, because it is the most important word in all of this: model. What played through those speakers was not a recording. Nobody captured the sound of a living dinosaur. There is no soft tissue left, no larynx, no muscle, no throat lining, none of the wet machinery that actually shapes a real animal's cry. What the computer produced is a prediction. It says, given this shape of air, these are the frequencies the shape would favour if breath moved through it. It is closer to answering what note this bottle could hum than to hearing anyone hum it. That distinction is not a technicality to wave past. It is the honest edge of the whole enterprise, and the careful researchers were the first to draw it. There is a second way to ask the same question, and it trades the computer for something you can touch. In the year 2024, an acoustics researcher named Hongjun Lin took the physical route. Rather than simulate the airflow inside a machine, he built a small tube model shaped after the crest's inner passage. He suspended that little instrument on fine thread so nothing would dampen it or muffle its ring. Then, instead of lungs, he used a speaker to push sound into one end, driving the model the way a breath would have. At the other end, he set a microphone to listen for what the shape gave back. Feed a whole spread of frequencies into a resonating body, and most of them pass through thin and unremarkable. But a few match the shape's natural tuning, and those swell, reinforced, standing up out of the noise. The microphone records which ones. It is the bottle test again, run with patience and instruments, letting the object itself tell you the notes it prefers, rather than asking a computer to calculate them. Two methods, one built of numbers and one built of a suspended tube and a speaker, and they are useful precisely because they can check each other. And they do not always agree at first. This is the part that keeps the work honest. Lin's physical model found more internal chambers folded inside the crest than the earlier simpler picture had assumed. The 1997 reconstruction leaned on the crest, behaving like a single looping horn, one bore bent back on itself. The newer look suggests something more subdivided, more like a set of connected cavities than a clean trombone loop. That did not erase the old result. It confirmed the basic finding that the crest resonated, that it was built to make and shape low sound. But it revised the anatomy underneath the finding, and it did so because the scanning and modelling had grown sharper. That pattern is worth carrying with you, because it is how this science actually moves. The reconstruction is never finished and sealed. It is a best current answer, resting on the best current scan, waiting for a better one. Between David Weishampel's early acoustic analysis of these crests back in 1981 and the Sandia model and Lynn's suspended tube, the estimate of what a Parasaurolophus could resonate has been picked up and turned over and adjusted more than once. Each pass keeps the durable core and files down the guesswork around it. The voice, if you can call a modelled resonance a voice, has been refined the way a photograph sharpens as you nudge the focus, not conjured whole from nothing. So sit with what these techniques honestly deliver. They cannot hand you the sound of a herd calling across a floodplain in the fading warmth of a Cretaceous evening. No instrument reaches back through 75 million years and lifts a living cry out of the air. What they can do is take a hollow bone, read it in hundreds of paper-thin slices, rebuild the empty shape the animal breathed through, and calculate, or physically coax, the notes that shape was built to favour. It is a modelled voice, drawn from geometry, flagged at every step as inference rather than fact. That modesty is not a weakness in the work. It is the reason you can trust the part that survives. And notice what this method quietly proved about the animal, quite apart from any single note. A shape this large and this specialised, this much bone spent on folded air, was almost certainly spent for a reason. Nature does not usually build an elaborate resonator and leave it silent. The crest is a strong hint that these animals lived in a world of low, carrying sound, calling and answering across the open ground between them, which is exactly why the reconstruction does not end at the crest. Once you accept that a fossil can be read for the sound it once shaped, the same patient question spreads outward to other bones, other animals, other kinds of evidence entirely. A preserved throat, the oldest known voice box of a true bird, the living cousins whose cries we can still record today. Each of these opens a separate trail back toward the vanished soundscape, and each trail runs at its own angle, through its own creature, toward its own careful, guarded conclusion. The first of those trails runs straight through the strangest headgear the dinosaur world ever grew. The first of those trails runs straight through the strangest headgear the dinosaur world ever grew. The first of those trails runs straight through the strangest headgear the dinosaur world ever grew. Stand for a moment on a floodplain in what is now northwestern New Mexico, roughly 75 million years ago. The air is warm and heavy, thick with the smell of river mud and crushed fern. Conifers rise in loose stands along a slow brown channel. The season leans toward monsoon, and the ground holds water in every low place. Somewhere in the middle distance a shape moves through the greenery, taller at the hip than a grown horse, longer than a delivery truck. It walks on all fours, then rises briefly onto its hind legs to reach a higher branch. On the back of its skull, curving up and back, is a long hollow tube of bone. This is Parasaurolophus tubicen, and you would hear it before you understood it. Let the numbers settle over you slowly, because they are worth sitting with. This animal stretched somewhere between 33 and 36 feet from the tip of its broad snout to the end of its tail. It weighed, by careful estimate, between 5,500 and 8,800 pounds, which is to say somewhere between a large pickup and a small elephant. It belonged to the Lambeosaurine hadrosaurs, the crested branch of the duck-billed dinosaurs, and it browsed the low and middle greenery of these subtropical rivers with a wide, flattened beak. Its teeth were packed into dense, grinding batteries, hundreds of them stacked and ready, replacing themselves as they wore down. But the beak and the teeth are not why paleontologists keep returning to this creature. The reason sits on top of its head. The crest of Parasaurolophus tubuscan ran about 4.5 feet long. Picture the full reach of your own arm held out from the shoulder, then imagine a smooth tube of bone about that length sweeping back off the skull. Now imagine that the tube is not solid. Inside it, the nasal passages loop up from the nostrils, run toward the far end of the crest, fold back on themselves, and return down into the throat. The breath that entered at the nose had to travel the length of your outstretched arm and back before it ever reached the lungs. A path folded on itself, like a held breath cupped inside two hands. That folded path is the whole puzzle, because a hollow tube, curved and looping, is exactly the shape a musician would choose if the goal were sound. This animal lived in the San Juan Basin, in rocks geologists call the Kirtland Formation, and possibly the older Fruitland Formation nearby. Its world dates to the late Campanian, roughly 76.5 to 73 million years ago. These were not empty lands. Herds moved through the floodplains, and a herd is a place where being heard matters. A low call that carries across open, half-wooded country is worth more than a bright one that dies in the underbrush. And the crest, whatever else it did, was built to move air. For a long time that was only a suspicion. A strangely shaped bone invites strange ideas. Over the decades, people proposed that the crest was a snorkel for swimming, or an air tank for diving, or a weapon, or a salt gland, or simply an ornament with no use at all beyond being seen. The snorkel idea fails on a simple point. There is no opening at the tip. The tube is closed at the far end, so no air could pass through to the outside. Whatever the crest was for, the answer had to lie inside the loop, not beyond it. The person who took that loop seriously as an instrument was David Weiss-Hampel, and the year was 1981. Weiss-Hampel published in the journal Paleobiology, and his approach was patient and physical. He treated the internal nasal passages of lambeosaurin crests as what they resembled, resonating chambers, columns of air with a shape and a length, and therefore a natural pitch. Blow across the mouth of a bottle, and the bottle answers with one note, set by the volume of air inside it. Lengthen the column, and the note drops. Weiss-Hampel worked through the geometry of these looping bony tubes and asked what notes such air columns would prefer. His answer was low. The adult crest, with its long, folded passage, favoured deep frequencies, the kind of sound you feel in your sternum as much as hear in your ears, and here his study turned toward something tender. A juvenile Parasaurolophus had a smaller crest, a shorter tube, a shorter air column. A shorter column means a higher note, so the young would have called at higher pitches than the adults, in the ordinary way that a small instrument sits above a large one. Sit with what that implies. If the adults rumbled low and the young piped higher, then a mother and her offspring carried different voices, set apart by the size of the bone on their heads. Recognition becomes possible. A parent could pick a particular call out of the general noise of the herd. A juvenile in trouble had a voice that did not sound like every other voice around it. Weiss-Hampel did not claim to have recorded any of this. He claimed only that the anatomy made it plausible, that the physics of these tubes pointed toward a herd that could tell its members apart by sound. That is a gentle picture to hold as you drift. A wide green floodplain, a scattered herd of large calm animals, and a layer of low sound moving between them, threaded through with the higher voices of the young. Weiss-Hampel worked with rulers and equations and the physics of pipes. 16 years later, a different team took the same crest and fed it to a machine. The place was Albuquerque, New Mexico. The people were Tom Williamson, a paleontologist at the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science, and Carl Diegert, a computer scientist at Sandia National Laboratories. Their patient, in a sense, was a fossil crest of Parasaurolophus tubicen, and what they did to it, in the plainest terms, was give it a medical scan. At St. Joseph Medical Center, they ran the fossil through a CT scanner, the same kind of machine that images a living body. The scanner cut the crest into 350 cross-sections, each slice taken about 1/8 of an inch from the next. Think of slicing a loaf of bread into hundreds of thin, even pieces, except the loaf is bone that has been dead for something like 75 million years, and each slice is a photograph rather than a cut. Stack those images back up inside a computer, and you rebuild the hollow interior exactly, every twist of the looping nasal tube in 3 dimensions. Then came the part that turns anatomy into a voice. Degas took that reconstructed geometry and treated the bony tube the way an acoustician treats the bore of a trombone. A trombone is, after all, just a long folded tube of a particular shape, and its sound comes from how air resonates along that shape. So the team modelled the airflow, the resonance, the frequencies, the shape of this fossil crest would favour. They asked the computer what note this specific bone, this specific loop wanted to make. What came out of the speakers was not a roar. It was a deep, resonating, low-frequency moan, a sound that could shift in pitch as the modelled airflow changed. Low and slow and mournful, more like a distant foghorn than anything with teeth. And the team went one careful step further. They proposed that because no 2 crests were identical in their exact internal geometry, each animal would have carried a slightly different voice, distinguishable from the next, a sound signature grown into the skull. Hold that image against the movie sounds you already carry. A generation grew up certain that a large dinosaur must scream. Here instead was a low rolling note, produced not by a throat, but by a computer reading the inside of a bone, and the note it produced was calm. It helps to be exact about what that result was and what it was not. Nobody recorded a Parasaurolophus. Nobody could. What the Sandia team recorded was the resonant behaviour of a shape. The noted tube of that geometry prefers when air moves through it. The living animal added everything the bone cannot preserve. It added the soft tissues of the nasal lining, the throat, the muscles, the force and rhythm of its own breath. The bone sets the stage for a sound. The animal long gone was the one who actually played it. Still, the shape is real, and the shape leans low. That much the fossil itself insists on. This is a good place to breathe and let the deep time settle around you. You're lying still in the present, and yet you have been walking through a New Mexico that no longer exists, following a note that no ear, alive, has ever heard. The work that reconstructs it is slow, careful, and quietly astonishing, and it has been going on across more than 40 years, each decade adding a little more resolution to a sound that was never captured, only inferred. And the inferring was not finished in 1997. Better tools kept arriving, and with them, better questions. Move forward to 2024, and to a scientist named Hongjun Lin, working out of New York University. Lin presented at the 187th meeting of the Acoustical Society of America, and the approach this time was refreshingly hands-on. Rather than trust a purely digital model, Lin built a physical tube shaped after the crest, a small instrument you could actually excite and measure. The model hung suspended on fine cotton threads so that nothing damped its resonance. A speaker drove sound into it. A microphone listened to what it did with that sound, which frequencies it amplified, which it swallowed, where it liked to ring. A physical model can surprise you in ways a simplified digital one cannot, and this one did. Earlier work, including some of the reasoning behind the 1997 model, had leaned on a fairly simple picture of the crest as a single folded loop, a trombone bent back on itself once. Lin's physical tube suggested the real interior was busier than that. There were more internal chambers than the simple loop assumed, more branchings and spaces where air could resonate. The headline finding did not overturn the basic idea. The crest still worked as a resonator, still favoured low sound. But the anatomy of how it did so was more intricate than the tidy trombone had allowed. That pattern, a good idea confirmed but complicated, is what honest science tends to look like from the inside. Weishampel pointed at resonance with rulers. Sandia rendered a voice with a scanner. Lin, with a tube on threads, found that the instrument had more rooms inside it than anyone had drawn. Each pass kept the low rumble and refined the plumbing that produced it. None of them, and this matters, ever pressed record on a living throat. So let the honest uncertainty stand plainly, because a calm mind can hold a doubt without flinching. No soft tissue of a Parasaurolophus has ever been found. There is no fossil larynx for this animal, no preserved windpipe, no scrap of the nasal lining that shaped the sound. Every acoustic result you have heard about here, the low moan, the shifting pitch, the individual voices, is a model. It is the note that a bone geometry prefers, dressed by careful people in the physics of instruments. It is not a recording, and it never can be. When you hear the modelled voice of Parasaurolophus, you are hearing mathematics wearing the shape of a skull. There is a further debate underneath all of it, and it deserves its own quiet moment. Suppose the crest really did resonate, as 3 separate lines of work suggest. Was sound its main job? Or was it mostly something to be seen? A tall, colourful crest sweeping off the skull is a signal to the eye as much as a resonator for the ear. In a herd, an animal that can be recognised at a glance has advantages that have nothing to do with sound. Many paleontologists suspect the honest answer is both, that the crest served the eye and the ear together, display and voice grown into a single arc of the bone. Which mattered more is still argued, and no fossil settles it. You can let that stay open. Not every question needs a floor tonight. What is not seriously in doubt is the low register. Whatever mix of seeing and sounding the crest performed, its shape, tested 3 ways across 4 decades, keeps pointing toward deep frequencies rather than high ones. This fits the world it lived in. A big animal on an open floodplain, moving in loose herds through half-wooded country, benefits from a call that carries. Low sound travels farther through cluttered air and around obstacles than high sound does. If Parasaurolophus needed to reach a companion a long way off, across water and reeds and stands of conifer, a deep note was the better tool. The habitat and the instrument agree. Try to feel the scale of it in your own body, since the numbers alone slide past. The crest was about as long as your arm. The air inside it had to travel out along that arm and fold all the way back before the breath was done, a loop cupped in the skull like a held breath in 2 hands. Now imagine that folded column set ringing, low enough that you would feel it in your teeth and the flat of your chest, before you were sure you had heard anything at all. That is the register these studies keep landing on, not a scream thrown at the sky. A pressure moving through the ground and the air felt as much as heard. And imagine, because the evidence gently allows it, that no 2 of these calls were quite the same. One animal's loop a fraction longer, another's a fraction wider, each shape tuned by growth to a slightly different note. A herd of low voices, each one particular, drifting across the floodplain at dusk while the light goes copper over the slow river, the young calling higher, the adults answering lower, sound sorting the herd into families by the size of the bone each animal carried. That is the story of what a hollow crest can tell you, and it is a great deal. From a curved tube of fossil bone, patient people recovered a register, a plausible spread of pitches between old and young, and a real chance that individuals could be told apart by ear. They did it with rulers, then a scanner, then a tube hung on cotton threads, and each time the bone answered low. Few fossils give up so much of a lost animal's behaviour. A skull that is also, in effect, a preserved instrument is a rare and generous thing, but notice what even the most generous crest never surrenders. It gives you the shape of the resonator. It gives you the note the shape prefers. It does not give you the source of the sound, the throat that pushed the air, the tissues that buzzed or hissed or hummed to set the whole tube ringing in the first place. A trombone tells you nothing about the lips that buzz into it. In the same way, this loop of bone stays silent about the living throat below it. You have followed this first trail as far as bone alone can carry you, from a warm New Mexico floodplain through 4 decades of careful modelling, down to a low note no ear ever caught. It has been a rich walk, and it ends at an honest wall. Parasaurolophus tubicen never sang into an empty world. Picture the same kind of warm floodplain a little further north and a little earlier in time. Move your eye up to what is now Alberta, to the rock of the Dinosaur Park Formation. laid down roughly 77 to 75 million years ago. Here the duckbills arrived in a whole gallery of shapes. They browsed the same conifers and ferns. They waded the same slow brown rivers under the same humid, insect-loud air. And each kind wore a different hollow crest, which means each kind most likely carried a different instrument built into its own skull. Stand in it for a moment before the animals arrive. The air is warm and wet, thick enough to feel on your skin, heavy with the smell of mud and rotting leaves and resin. Ferns crowd the riverbanks. Conifers and early flowering trees close in overhead, and the light comes down green and broken. It is exactly the kind of open, half-wooded country where a deep, resonant call could roll a long way between the members of a scattered herd. A low sound carries further than a high, thin one, and this was a world built for low sounds. Start with Corythosaurus. Its name means helmet lizard, and the helmet is the whole point. On top of its head rose a tall, rounded crest, thin from side to side and broad from front to back. Curved like a half disc stood up on its edge. Hold your hand flat and imagine a dinner plate balanced upright on its rim against your palm. That is close to the footprint of the thing, a wide plate of hollow bone standing straight up off the snout and the brow. Corythosaurus grew to around 30 feet long. A grown adult likely weighed somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 pounds, 3 to 4 tons of slow, deliberate herbivore. It lived in Alberta roughly 77 to 75 million years ago, a close neighbour in deep time to the Parasaurolophus of the south. Inside that rounded crest, the nasal passages did not run in a straight line. They looped. Air drawn in through the nostrils travelled up into the hollow chambers of the plate, curved back on itself, and returned down toward the throat. A rounded, plate-shaped resonator holds a different internal volume than a long back-swept tube. A short, wide chamber and a long, narrow one do not ring at the same note, the way a stubby pipe and a deep one never quite match. So the reasonable inference, and it is only an inference, is that a Corythosaurus and a Parasaurolophus standing in one clearing would have sounded in different registers, two low instruments of different bore. Now set a second shape beside it. Lambeosaurus, the crest that gave the whole family its name, since Lambeosaurin simply means Lambeosaurus-like. Its crest was stranger than a plate. It rose as a hatchet, a forward-leaning blade of hollow bone above the eyes, with a solid, bony rod angling back behind it like a handle. 2 parts, 2 directions, 1 skull. Lambeosaurus lived in those same Alberta floodplains, around 76 to 75 million years ago, right alongside Corythosaurus. Large individuals reached something in the range of 30 to 50 feet, depending on the species and on how the broken pieces are read. Stand one of the bigger ones beside you, and its hip would clear the top of a 2-story house. That puts the largest of them among the biggest duckbills of their whole world. The hatchet was hollow where the blade rose, and the nasal tubes wound up into that forward chamber before doubling back down. Change the shape of the resonating cavity, and you change the sound it favours. A blade-shaped chamber, a rounded plate, a long swept horn, 3 different geometries carved out of the same simple trick, routing the breath through bone before it reaches the lungs. If each one resonated, and the models suggest each one could, then the sound of this landscape was never one note repeated. It was a set of distinct low voices, each one keyed to the shape of the animal that carried it, and that variety runs even inside a single name. Return to Parasaurolophus itself. The southern species, Parasaurolophus tubicin from the San Juan Basin of New Mexico, measured roughly 33 to 36 feet long and weighed somewhere between 5,500 and 8,800 pounds. Its crest was the long one, close to 4.5 feet of curved hollow horns sweeping back off the skull, packed with looping internal tubes that later scanning showed were more intricate than any simple single loop. That animal lived roughly 76.5 to 73 million years ago, browsing the subtropical rivers of the southwest. Then there is the northern, original species, Parasaurolophus walkeri, first described from Alberta, from that same dinosaur park world of around 76.5 to 75 million years ago. Walkeri carried the long back-swept crest too, but the proportions in the internal looping are not identical between the two. Crest length, the degree of the curve, and the exact path of the tubes shift as you move from one to the other, and they shift with age as well. A juvenile did not carry the full adult horn. Its crest was shorter, its internal tubes less developed, the airspace inside it smaller. A smaller pipe, everything else being equal, tends to ring at a higher pitch. That last point is not a guess pulled from the air. It goes back to the earliest careful work on these skulls. In 1981, David Weishampel modelled the Lambeosaurine crest as an internal nasal resonating chamber, and he proposed that adults, with their larger looping tubes, called at lower frequencies, while juveniles, with their smaller crests, called higher. If that holds, then a herd was never a single tone. It was a spread of pitches, deep from the big old adults, higher and thinner from the young, a family able to tell itself apart by voice alone. Parent and offspring, recognizing each other on air rooted through bone. Growth is part of why we can even reach for the idea. For several of these crested duckbills, paleontologists have recovered not just lone adults but whole growth series, from small young animals up to full-grown giants in Corythosaurus, and in a close relative called Hippacrosaurus, a rounded crest Lambeosaurine of similar size, around 30 feet long from the very late Cretaceous. Watching a crest swell across a lifetime is watching an instrument being slowly retuned. The same throat, pushing breath through a chamber that grows longer and more looping every year, would have dropped in pitch as the animal aged. There is a fair caution to layer over all of this. The crest was almost certainly more than an instrument. A tall plate of bone standing off the skull is also a flag, something to be seen across a clearing, a signal of species and size and maturity to any eye watching from the tree line. Paleontologists still debate how much of the crest was for sound and how much was for show, and the honest answer is that it was very likely both at once. A structure can carry a low call and a bright silhouette in the same breath. The two jobs do not cancel each other, they stack. So stand in that clearing one more time and let the cast fill in around you. A Corythosaurus with its upright plate, a Lambeosaurus with its hatchet and its back-swept handle, a Parasaurolophus of the north or the south with its long curved horn, adults low, juveniles higher, each genus keyed to a different internal shape. If you could have stood there and listened, and you cannot, the landscape would not have roared at you. It would have hummed and moaned in overlapping low registers, a scattered orchestra of wind instruments grazing quietly across one floodplain, each section holding its own slightly different note. Some of those notes would have sat so low you would feel them in your chest and through the soles of your feet before your ears caught up. But hold the honesty close, because the honest part is the part that lets you rest easy with all of this. Everything we have said about pitch is geometry. We can measure the length of a crest, the width of a chamber, the path a tube takes, and we can feed those measurements into a model that tells us what notes such a shape would favour. That is real work, and it is careful work. What no measurement can give us is timbre, the grain and colour and texture of the actual living sound. Two horns of identical length can sound completely unlike each other, depending on the soft tissue lining them, the tension in the throat below, the force behind the breath. None of that soft tissue survives. Not in a Corythosaurus, not in a Lambeosaurus, not in a Parasaurolophus of either species. The crest is the one part that turns reliably to stone, so the crest is the part we model, and the model stops at the exact place where the flesh once began. You can hold the shape of the pipe in your hand. You cannot hold the sound. That is the quiet limit of this whole gallery of instruments. Bone shaped like an instrument can only tell you so much, and for the rest you need an actual throat. Bone shaped like an instrument can only tell you so much, and for the rest you need an actual throat. So leave the river valleys behind now, and travel in your mind toward the dry heart of what will one day be Mongolia. There are no floodplains here. There is no soft green edge of conifer forest, no slow brown water carrying leaves. There is sand, and more sand, ridged and combed by a wind that never fully rests. This is the Gobi of the Middle Campanian, roughly 75 million years ago, and it is a desert already, an ocean of dunes that stretches past the curve of the world. Stand inside it for a moment, feel the heat come up off the ground in slow waves. The light is flat and merciless, the sky a pale, scoured blue with almost nothing in it. When the wind lifts, the whole surface of the dune begins to move, a fine hissing sheet of grains pouring sideways across the crest. That sound, that dry whisper of sand on sand, is most of what you would hear out here. It is the quiet the animals of this place were born into. Among those animals moves a small armoured thing, low to the ground and unhurried. This is a young Pinacosaurus grundrii, an ankylosaur, a squat four-legged plant-eater built like a living cobblestone. An adult would be broad and heavy and plated with bone, but this one is a juvenile, and it is not large. It walks with its belly close to the sand, its wide head swinging slowly from side to side, cropping at the low tough vegetation that clings to the sheltered flanks of the dunes. Its body is armoured across the back in a mosaic of bony studs set into the skin. Its legs are short and strong. It is an animal made for patience, not speed. You would not at first think of a creature like this as having a voice at all. It is silent as it feeds, or nearly so. Whatever sounds it makes are lost inside the larger hush of the desert, and that is the deep problem paleontology has always faced with dinosaur sound. The parts of an animal that make noise are soft: muscle, membrane, cartilage, the thin, wet tissues of a throat. These things rot. They collapse and vanish long before the bones have finished settling into the ground. For more than a century, the throat of every non-avian dinosaur that ever lived was simply a blank, a missing page, a silence we could not read. Which is what makes this particular young Pinacosaurus so extraordinary. Because something is about to happen to it that will preserve, against every reasonable expectation, the one part of it we most wanted to find. Watch the dune above it. The wind has been building all afternoon, and now the whole slope of sand at the crest has grown unstable, oversteepened, quietly waiting. It gives way. Not violently, not like a wave breaking, but like a soft, heavy collapse, a slow avalanche of dry grains sliding down and around and over. The little armoured animal is caught low on the slope with nowhere to go. The sand closes over its body the way flour pours slowly over the back of a spoon, filling every hollow, sealing every gap, smoothing itself flat above the place where it was standing. In a matter of moments there is nothing to see, only the dune, reformed, blank again, hissing gently in the wind as if nothing at all had been lost. For the animal, it is an ending. For the fossil record, it is a rare and generous kind of luck. Sudden burial, fast and total, is the thing that preserves an animal whole. The sand packs in before scavengers can scatter the bones, before the joints can loosen, before the delicate structures fall out of place. The young Pinacosaurus goes down into the dune with its skeleton articulated, its limbs still where they belong, its head still attached to its neck. And deep inside that neck, cradled and packed in fine-grained sand, a handful of tiny throat bones settle into the dark and stay exactly where they were. They will wait there for 75 million years. Let that number sit with you for a breath, because it is easy to say and impossible to truly feel. 75 million years is not a length of time the human body has any way to hold. Whole mountain ranges rose and wore back down to plains in that span. The continents slid into new arrangements. The Gobi itself dried and shifted and rearranged its dunes 10,000 times over, and through all of it, in the dark, in the pressure and the silence, those few small bones kept their shape and their positions relative to one another, waiting to be read. The place where they finally came back into the light is called Ukar Tolgod, a fossil locality in the Mongolian Gobi so rich that it has become one of the most important windows into late Cretaceous life anywhere on Earth. Its sandstones hold articulated skeletons in almost unbelievable abundance, animals caught and sealed by exactly the kind of dune events that took our young Pinacosaurus. The specimen carries a catalogue number, IGSTN 100-3186, and it is a juvenile, and when researchers examined the region of its throat, they found something no one had ever seen before in any dinosaur outside of birds. They found a larynx. In 2023, a team led by Junki Yoshida, with Yoshitsugu Kobayashi and Tomoyuki Sato and their colleagues, described the specimen in the journal Communications Biology under a title that says plainly what it means: an ankylosaur larynx providing insights for bird-like vocalization in non-avian dinosaurs. Read past the careful phrasing, and the claim underneath is enormous. This is the first fossilized voice box ever recovered from a non-avian dinosaur. The first actual throat, not a resonating skull chamber, not a hollow crest, but the true sound gate itself, preserved and articulated in the ground. What survived is a small set of elements. There is a hyoid, the bone that supports the base of the tongue and the floor of the throat, and there are two laryngeal elements, the cricoid and the arytenoid, the load-bearing pieces of the larynx itself. Crucially, they were preserved in near-life articulation. That phrase matters more than almost anything else in the description. It means the bones were not scattered, not tumbled into a jumble, not found separately and reassembled by guesswork. They were sitting together, in place, in the arrangement they held while the animal was alive. You are looking at a throat as it actually was, frozen mid-function, 75 million years old. Now hold your own hand up in front of you and fold your fingers loosely into a fist. Look at the small, hard knuckles across the back of it. The throat bones of this creature were no bigger than that, a handful of little pieces you could have closed inside your palm. That is the scale of the thing that made silence break in a dinosaur. Not some vast bellowing apparatus, not a cathedral of bone, but a cluster of elements smaller than the knuckles of your folded hand, tucked into the soft base of a young animal's neck. It is a strange and humbling smallness. The organ that might have carried this creature's voice across the dunes would have fit comfortably in the cup of your hand. And here is where the description turns quietly unsettling. Because when Yoshida and his colleagues looked closely at the shapes of those two bones, at how they were built and how they fit together, the anatomy did not look the way you might expect the throat of a squat armoured reptile to look. It looked, in certain specific ways, like the throat of a bird. Consider what they actually measured. The cricoid, the ring at the base of the larynx, was enlarged. Not ordinary, not modest, but distinctly large for the animal. And the arytenoid, the paired element that in living animals helps open and close and shape the airway, was elongated, drawn out longer than a simple reptilian throat would need it to be. And the two of them were joined together by a joint that was firm and yet mobile, firm enough to hold its structure under the push of moving air, mobile enough to shift, to flex, to change the shape of the opening as breath passed through it. In the language of the anatomists, a kinetic joint, a joint made for motion. Put those features together, an enlarged cricoid, an elongated arytenoid, and a firm but moving joint linking them, and you have the components of what the researchers cautiously called a possible bird-like vocal modifier, not a whistle, not a song, a modifier. A structure that could take the raw flow of air from the lungs and shape it, gate it, sculpt it into a wider range of sounds than a plain rigid tube ever could. In living birds, this kind of laryngeal mobility, combined with other structures, supports an astonishing acoustic flexibility. To find even the beginnings of that architecture, that same principle of a movable, shaping throat in a lumbering armoured dinosaur from the Gobi is genuinely surprising. It suggests that the machinery for a flexible voice was present in the dinosaur lineage far earlier and far more broadly than anyone had firm evidence to claim. That is the hint. And now, because this is a channel that respects you enough to tell you where the evidence stops, you need to hear exactly how far that hint does and does not go. Because it would be very easy and very wrong to let this discovery run ahead of itself. Start with the simplest limit. This is a single specimen. One animal out of all the ankylosaurs that ever lived across tens of millions of years has given up its throat to us. And it is a juvenile, a young individual, not a fully grown adult. We do not know whether the same throat anatomy held in older Pinacosaurus, whether the cricoid and arytenoid changed shape and proportion as the animal matured, the way so many features of young dinosaurs did. We do not know whether other ankylosaur lineages, the many cousins spread across the world, shared this bird-like arrangement or built their throats some entirely different way. A single juvenile is a keyhole. It shows you one room at one moment in one animal's life. It does not show you the house. Then there is the deeper limit, the one that matters most. This is a vocal modifier, not a recorded call, and a modifier is not the sound source. In living birds, the true generator of song and call is not the larynx at all. It is a separate organ entirely, an organ called the syrinx, set lower down where the windpipe splits toward the two lungs. The syrinx is what actually makes the sound in a bird. The larynx above it shapes and gates that sound, but it does not create it. And no syrinx has ever been found in any non-avian dinosaur. Not in this Pinacosaurus, not in any of them, despite generations of careful digging and good fossil sampling of the group. So be clear with yourself about what the throat of IGM 100-3186 does and does not prove. It does not give you a call you can play back. It does not tell you the pitch, or the loudness, or whether this animal boomed or hissed or coughed or hummed. It gives you a capacity, a hint of capacity, the researchers would say. The presence of a structure that could have shaped a range of sounds, without any direct evidence of what those sounds actually were. A voice box is not a voice. It is the possibility of one, held in bone. And the honest thing, the calm and accurate thing, is to hold that possibility gently and not squeeze it into a certainty it cannot bear. If you are listening tonight and finding some quiet pleasure in the way real evidence gets weighed, in the difference between what a fossil shows and what we wish it showed, then follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. It costs you nothing, and it keeps these long, slow walks through deep time coming to you. Now settle back down into the goby, because there is more to understand about why this particular throat survived at all, and about the strange company the young Pinacosaurus kept in death. Pinacosaurus granderi is, in a sense, a creature we know mostly through its children. The species is famous among paleontologists not for a single grand adult skeleton, but for its bone beds, its dense accumulations of young animals buried together. At a locality called Alagtig in Mongolia, expedition after expedition has pulled juvenile Pinacosaurus out of the ground in numbers that are hard to picture. Soviet and Mongolian teams recovered on the order of 30 skeletons there. Later, Mongolian, Japanese and Canadian expeditions recovered something like 70 more. That is around 100 young armoured dinosaurs from a single fossil ground, one of the largest juvenile-dominated ankylosaur assemblages known anywhere. And it is not the only such place. Across the border, at Bayan Mandahu in Inner Mongolia, China, roughly a dozen articulated Pinacosaurus skeletons have come out of the same kind of rock, again heavily weighted toward the young, articulated, remember, whole. Bones still in their living arrangement, not scattered by rivers or torn apart by scavengers. The pattern repeats across these desert localities, young armoured dinosaurs, preserved intact, packed together in the sand. Why so many, and why so young? The dune fields themselves are most of the answer. This was an environment prone to sudden burial, the exact process you watched take our juvenile earlier. Sandstorms that could bury an animal where it stood. dunes that could collapse and pour down a slope in moments, and there is a suggestion in these bone beds that young Pinacosaurus may have moved in groups, small herds of juveniles sheltering together, so that when a burial event came it took not one animal but many at once, sealing an entire group into the record in a single afternoon. Whether they truly herded, or simply gathered at the same scarce oases and were caught together by chance, is still debated. But the outcome is the same. The goby did not just kill these animals, it embalmed them. That is the gift hidden inside the harshness of this place. A gentler environment, a floodplain with rivers and rot and hungry scavengers, would almost never preserve something as fragile as a throat. Soft tissues and delicate small bones scatter and dissolve in a wet, active landscape. But the dry, fast, total burial of a collapsing dune is a kind of preservation almost designed to keep the delicate things in place. The cruelty of the desert and the completeness of its fossils are the same fact seen from two sides. Without the sand that took the young Pinacosaurus, you would have no window into its voice at all. There is one more caution worth folding in here, because it keeps you honest about ankylosaurs and sound. These animals are famous for something else inside their heads, a set of convoluted, corkscrewing nasal passages, long looping airways coiled up inside the snout. It is tempting to imagine those passages as resonators, as instruments, the way the hollow crests of the hadrosaurs were. But when researchers led by Jason Bork ran detailed scans and airflow models on ankylosaur relatives like Panoplosaurus and Euoplocephalus, they found that those twisting airways worked primarily as heat exchangers. They warmed the cold, dry inhaled air, in one case by nearly 32 degrees Fahrenheit, before it reached the lungs, with almost all of that warming happening right in the entrance of the nose. Their main measurable job was managing heat and moisture, not making music. So the nose for these animals was probably a radiator more than a horn, which leaves the small preserved larynx carrying the real weight of the sound story and reminds you not to hear an instrument in every hollow bone. So sit for a last moment with what this young armoured animal has actually handed us. A cluster of throat bones no larger than your folded knuckles, sealed in collapsing dune, carried through 75 million years of dark and pressure and lifted back into the light at Uqar-Tolgod. An enlarged cricoid, an elongated arytenoid, a firm, moving joint between them, shaped in a way that whispers, faintly and without proof, of the flexible throats of birds, not a call, not a song. Just the machinery of a possible voice, the oldest such machinery we have ever held, resting in the palm of a single juvenile from the goby. It is a beginning, and beginnings are their own kind of quiet marvel. For the first time, when you imagine a non-avian dinosaur making a sound, you are no longer imagining from pure guesswork. You have a real throat to build the sound around, a genuine anatomical door through which breath once passed. That is more than paleontology had a decade ago. It is a small, hard-won gift. And like most of the best things in this science, it arrives wrapped in careful uncertainty, asking you to want to know more without pretending you already do. But a modifier only shapes a sound that something else has already made. And to find the true source, the actual sound-making organ, the thing that turns moving air into a voice, you have to leave the goby behind and leave the ankylosaurs behind and follow the evidence into a different lineage entirely, one that leads to the birds. Stay in the goby a little longer, because this is where the throat was hiding. The armoured dinosaur called Pinacosaurus granduri is known to science mostly through its young, not from one lucky skeleton, but from crowds of them, packed into the old sandstone like a class that never grew up. Count the discoveries slowly, the way a person counts to fall asleep. Roughly 30 skeletons came out of the ground during the Soviet Mongolian expeditions, gathered across hard, careful field seasons under a wide sky. That alone would have made this little dinosaur one of the better-known armoured animals of Asia, but the counting was only beginning. Then came Alag Teague. Later crews working there, Mongolian and Japanese and Canadian, pulled about 70 more individuals from the rock season after patient season, had roughly 12 further skeletons, articulated and nearly whole, recovered from Bayan Mandahu in Inner Mongolia. Others trace back to the Jadokta beds at Bayan Zag, the place known as the Flaming Cliffs for the way the low sun sets the sandstone glowing. Taken together, these are among the largest gatherings of juvenile armoured dinosaurs anyone has ever found. A whole population of the young frozen in stone. To feel why this matters, stand for a moment in the world that made them. The late Cretaceous Gobi was not the endless dead sand of imagination. It was an arid dune field, wind-scoured and dry, dotted here and there with water where herds could crowd together to drink. The air was hot and gritty. Sand hissed across the crests of the dunes, and the light came down flat and hard without much shade to soften it. Into that landscape walked these squat, wide-bodied herbivores, low to the ground, plated with bone, moving in groups of their own kind. Now understand how so many of them died. This was a place of sudden violence in slow motion. The dunes could fail without warning, whole faces of sand set loose by storms, sliding down in heavy sheets. An animal caught at the base of a collapsing dune had no time and nowhere to go. The sand did not batter it apart. It simply arrived, tons of it at once, pressing in from every side, and held the body exactly where it lay, buried alive and buried intact in the same breath. That kind of burial is a strange gift to the people who dig. A body left on the surface comes apart. Scavengers tug at it, wind scatters it, rot works loose every joint until the skeleton becomes a puzzle with pieces missing. But an animal sealed away whole keeps its arrangement. The bones stay in the exact order the living flesh once wore them. This is why so many young Pinacosaurus surface from the Gobi articulated, some of them curled as if they had only lain down to rest, each small vertebra still trailing faithfully after the last. Even so, the throat is a different matter entirely. Consider what a larynx really is. It is a small cluster of cartilage elements set deep in the neck, loosely held, easily scattered. In most animals, these bones are lightly built and soft, among the very first things to vanish when a body breaks down. And across more than 100 years of unearthing dinosaurs, through thousands of skeletons on every continent, no one had ever found one preserved in place. The absence was so complete that it hardened into belief. If the voice box never fossilized, then perhaps how these animals sounded would stay forever beyond reach. Then came a single specimen, catalogued as IGM 100, 3 to 4 to 86. It was another young Pinacosaurus, this one from Ukar Tolgod, a locality in Mongolia famous among paleontologists for the delicacy of what it preserves. Its rocks were laid down in the Middle Campanian, somewhere between roughly 75 and 81 million years ago. For a long while, the specimen was just one more finely kept juvenile ankylosaur among many. The extraordinary thing was sitting quietly in its neck, waiting for someone to recognize it for what it was. Picture the slow labour of freeing it. The fossil comes up locked inside a block of hardened sand, and the preparator works by touch as much as by sight, reading shapes still hidden in the matrix. Somewhere near the base of the skull, a small knotted cluster begins to rise into view, dense and tightly grouped. It surfaces the way a knot of gravel presses up through the sole of a thin shoe when you step on it in the dark. You feel the shape before you truly see it. Not a stray tooth, not a loose splinter of bone, but a compact, deliberate arrangement, sitting precisely where nothing was expected to be. The team who described it, led by Junki Yoshida with colleagues including Yoshitsugu Kobayashi and Tomonori Sato, published their findings in 2023 in the journal Communications Biology. What they had was a hyoid, the bone that braces the tongue, together with two laryngeal elements preserved in near-life position. One was a cricoid, the ring that forms the base of the voice box. The other was an arytenoid, a bone that in living animals helps open and close the airway. Here the cricoid was unusually enlarged, and the arytenoid was elongated, and the two met at a joint that was firm and yet still able to move. A small hinge, built for control. That precise combination is what stopped them in their tracks. In its proportions and its position, this modest apparatus sat almost exactly where a living bird carries its larynx today, and it was shaped in a way that recalled a bird's throat far more than a lizard's. The authors are careful with their words. They describe it as a possible bird-like vocal modifier, not a song machine, and not proof of any particular call. A structure that could shape and adjust the sound passing through it, hinting at a wide range of possible voices in an animal most people would never picture as vocal at all. You might wonder why the recognition waited until 2023, when the specimen itself had been out of the ground for years. Part of the answer is simply that no one had been looking for such a thing. When something has never once been found, the eye stops expecting it, and small throat bones are easy to dismiss as fragments of something ordinary. It took researchers willing to hold a quiet, stubborn question. What if the voice box does sometimes survive, and we have merely been walking past it season after season? Once the question was finally asked, the bones were there to answer. The discovery gently rewrote an old assumption. For decades, the silence of the fossil record had been read almost as a verdict. No preserved voice box meant no way to study the voice, and it was tempting to let those two absences quietly merge, as though a thing that leaves no trace could never have mattered in life. This one specimen broke that easy logic apart. The soft tissue of the throat was indeed long gone, but the harder scaffolding beneath it had endured, pinned in place by the very same suffocating sand that had ended the animal in the first place. Death and preservation delivered in a single motion. It is worth staying honest about what one fossil can and cannot tell you. This is a single juvenile, one young individual out of 100 and more. Whether fully grown Parasaurolophus carried the same throat anatomy is simply unknown. Whether other armoured dinosaurs or other lineages entirely shared this bird-like arrangement is an open question. Waiting patiently on the next specimen to weather out of the next collapsing dune. A larynx is a modifier, not a recording. It tells you an animal owned the equipment to shape sound. It does not tell you the exact call it made on some hot morning 75 million years ago, standing among its own kind at the edge of the water. Still, something had shifted, and it does not shift back. For the first time, the throat of a non-avian dinosaur lay on a laboratory table, articulated, real, and readable under a lamp. An animal that had stood mute in every museum for more than a century now held, right there in its neck, the physical means of making a voice. The enlarged cricoid, the long arytenoid, the firm and mobile joint set between them. A small, unassuming instrument tucked inside an armoured body, drawn from an arid world of shifting sand and sudden burial. It is the closest thing we will ever have to a fossilised voice, and it changes how you hear all that ancient silence. A voice box is a beginning, but singing takes a different organ entirely, and for that you must travel to the bottom of the world. A voice box is a beginning, but singing takes a different organ entirely, and for that you must travel to the bottom of the world. Not the frozen bottom you know now. Go back roughly 69 million years to a coastline on what will one day be called the Antarctic Peninsula. There is no ice sheet here yet. The air is cool and damp, closer to a northern seacoast than a polar desert. Low forests of southern conifers hold the slopes. Ferns crowd the wet ground. And along a margin of shallow grey-green sea, a small bird the size of a modern duck picks its way through the reeds, dipping its bill, unbothered, unhurried, alive in a world that has almost run out of time. You're standing on the edge of Vega Island, or the ground that will become it. The light here is strange, and you feel it before you understand it. In the long southern summer, the sun barely sets. It circles low and pale around the horizon, and the shallows glow for hours that never quite become night. That light is thin and washed out, weak as skim milk held up to a window, more a suggestion of brightness than the thing itself. It lays a faint sheen across the water. It touches the back of the small wading bird and does not warm it much. Watch the bird a moment. It floats and paddles like the ducks you know, because it is, in the deepest sense, one of their kin. Its body is built for water. The legs sit far back, the feet push. The bill strains the shallows for soft food. It belongs to the Anseriformes, the great branch that leads to living ducks, geese and swans. Its name, given long after its death, is Vegavis, and it matters more than almost any bird of its age, because of one fragile structure buried deep in its chest, where the windpipe splits to feed the lungs. That structure is a syrinx. It is the true singing organ of birds, and you carry nothing like it. Your voice comes from a larynx high in your throat at the top of the windpipe. A bird's voice comes from the bottom, at the fork, where the trachea divides into the two tubes running down into the lungs. That placement changes everything about the sound. It sits inside the airstream at the very moment it branches, and in many birds it can work each branch on its own, which is why a living songbird can, in effect, sing two notes at once. But hold that thought, because Vegavis is not a songbird, and its coast is not a place of song. Listen instead to what a shallow polar sea actually sounds like near the end of the Cretaceous. Water moves against a low shore, wind combs the reeds. Somewhere offshore waves break over a shelf you cannot see. There are calls here, yes, but they are flat and nasal, more honk than melody, the sort of sound a goose makes crossing a cold morning. The world has not yet invented the dawn chorus. That is the quiet secret this island keeps. Now step back and think about how rare it is that you can know any of this. Soft tissue almost never survives. A voice is made of cartilage, membrane, muscle, and moving air, and all of that usually rots away in days, long before mineral can replace bone. A syrinx is small, delicate, and hollow. It is one of the least likely things in an animal's body to reach you across deep time. For most of the age of dinosaurs, the sound organ simply vanished, leaving paleontologists to reason from bone and from living relatives instead. Which is what makes specimen MLP 93I31 so quietly extraordinary. That catalogue number belongs to the Vegavis holotype, the reference skeleton by which the species is defined. It was collected in 1993 from Cape Lamb on Vega Island, near the tip of the Antarctic peninsula. It came out of rock called the Lopez de Bertodano Formation, from a layer known as the Sandwich Bluff Member. The dating places it in the Middle Maastrichtian, roughly 69.2 to 68.4 million years ago. That is the last chapter of the Cretaceous, only a few million years before the world changes for good. Take a moment with those numbers, because they are the whole point. This bird lived near the very end, not in the deep middle of the Mesozoic, not among the first feathered gliders, but at the closing edge, when the great non-avian dinosaurs still walk the northern continents. And yet, its syrinx is the oldest one anyone has ever found, the oldest known voice box of its kind. The first syrinx of any age reported from the entire Mesozoic era. Everything before it, across more than 100 million years of birds and their ancestors, is silence in the fossil record. The discovery of that organ was described in 2016 in the journal Nature by the paleontologist Julia Clark and her colleagues, including the researcher Sankar Chatterjee. The title of the work was plain and startling at once. It announced fossil evidence of the avian vocal organ from the Mesozoic. For the first time, someone was holding, in mineral form, the actual instrument a Mesozoic bird had used to make sound. Not a model, not an inference from a nearby bone. The thing itself, or the shape it left behind. And here is the detail that makes it feel almost impossible. The syrinx was preserved in 3 dimensions, not flattened to a smear on a slab, the way most delicate fossils end up, pressed paper-thin by the weight of the rock above. This one kept its form. Its curves and rings held their shape through nearly 69 million years of burial, of pressure, of the slow chemistry of stone. When the researchers examined it, they could see how the tubes came together, how the walls curved, how the structure was arranged in space. A whisper of soft anatomy turned to rock and still standing up. Think about what had to go right for that. A small bird dies along a cool coast. Its body settles into sediment quickly enough that scavengers and currents do not scatter it. Fine mud packs around the chest and into the branching of the windpipe. Minerals seep in before the cartilage collapses, filling and bracing the hollow form. Then the whole thing waits, quiet and undisturbed, while continents drift and the climate turns and ice eventually grips the land above. The odds against it are enormous. You're looking at a fluke of preservation that gives you a voice from the deep past. Now, what did the researchers actually see when they looked inside? This is where the shape of the sound begins to emerge. The Vegavis syrinx is asymmetrical. Its two sides are not mirror images of each other. The structure suggests two separate sound sources, a left and a right, each capable of vibrating on its own. In principle, that is the same trick living birds use, the two-voiced arrangement that lets one animal produce more than one note at a time. The hardware for a divided voice was already there, at the bottom of the world, at the end of the Cretaceous. Let me give you a way to feel that, because the anatomy is easy to lose in words. Imagine your windpipe as a single soft tube running down toward your lungs. Now, imagine that near the bottom it splits into two narrower tubes, like a drinking straw cut and forked into a Y. Pinch each of those two straws lightly between a finger and a thumb, one straw in each hand. Loosen one, and air passes with a low buzz. Loosen the other, and a second buzz joins it, slightly different in pitch. That doubled, pinched airway is the ghost of what this bird carried in its chest. But notice what that arrangement points toward, because it is not what you might expect. The comparison the researchers drew was not to a songbird's clear whistling melody. It was to the honking of modern waterfowl, the ducks and geese to which Vegavis is related. The asymmetry and the structure fit a nasal, blaring, two-toned call far better than a delicate tune. Not a warble drifting over a meadow, a flat carrying honk crossing cold water. If you have heard geese pass overhead on a grey day, you have heard the family resemblance of the oldest voice box known. So when you stand on that imagined shore and listen for the sound of Vegavis, do not reach for beauty. Reach for something plainer and stranger. A duck-sized bird out on the flat pale water throwing a harsh, doubled honk across the shallows. The call bounces off the low reeds and fades into the wind. There is no answering song from the forest behind you, no ripple of trills at first light. Just this, a working call, functional and blunt, in a world where true singing has not arrived. The dawn chorus, you know, is still tens of millions of years away. That absence is the deepest lesson the little bird carries, and it reaches far beyond one skeleton on one island. Here is the reasoning, laid out slowly, the way the researchers set it out. No syrinx has ever been found in any non-avian dinosaur, not one. And this is not for lack of looking. The dinosaur record has been sampled hard, across many groups, many places, many exquisitely preserved specimens. Feathers have survived, skin has survived, stomach contents, brooding postures, even a fossil larynx in an armoured dinosaur. But never a syrinx, in any dinosaur outside the birds. Follow that absence where it leads. If the singing organ had been present in the common ancestors of dinosaurs, or deep among the non-avian dinosaurs, you would expect at least a few of them to have left a trace of it, somewhere in all that careful collecting. Instead, there is a clean blank, and then, right at the end of the Cretaceous, a syrinx appears in a bird. The simplest reading is that the organ evolved late. It emerged within the bird lineage itself, near the close of the Mesozoic, rather than far back among the older dinosaurs. Sit with what that implies about the sound of the lost world, If the syrinx came late, then most non-avian dinosaurs almost certainly could not sing the way a songbird sings today. No trills from a triceratops, no melody from a tyrannosaur. Whatever those animals did with their voices, and they surely did something, it was not built on the two-voice singing instrument at the fork of the windpipe. That capacity seems to have shown up at the very end, in a small feathered branch, and then survived the extinction that erased almost everything else. Now, honesty matters here, and the researchers were careful, so you should be too. This is an argument from absence of evidence, and absence of evidence is not the same as proof. Not finding a syrinx in non-avian dinosaurs does not physically prove that none of them ever had one. Soft tissue is fickle. The next quarry, the next season, the next impossibly lucky burial could always turn up something that shifts the picture. The claim is a careful inference from a wide, consistent blank, not a sealed and finished verdict. Good science says so out loud, but it is a strong inference all the same, and it is the best reading of what the rocks currently show. The pattern is clean. A long silence, broken only at the end by a honking waterfowl at the edge of Antarctica. And so, for now, the reasonable picture of the Mesozoic soundscape is one without song. Booms, perhaps. Hisses and hoots, and low resonant rumbles, yes. But not the layered music of a modern forest morning. That music is younger than the giants. It is, in the long view of deep time, a late arrival. If you're drifting towards sleep as this unfolds, let it be part of the calm rather than a thing to hold, and wherever you happen to be listening, follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Then let your attention settle back onto the pale water and the small bird, and we will stay here a while longer, in the cool light at the bottom of the world, where the oldest known voice still carries across the shallows. Come back to that light now, because the setting of this bird's life is as remarkable as its throat. The Antarctic peninsula of the late Cretaceous was not the white waste you picture. It was cool temperate, closer to a rainy modern coastline in the far south than to any ice field. Forests grew, rivers ran to the sea, wetland margins spread where fresh water met salt, thick with the soft plants and small creatures a wading bird needs. Vegavis lived along that seam, a swimmer and a wader, feeding in the shallows the way its living relatives still do. But the latitude wrote its own hard rule into every year, and that rule was light. This close to the pole, the year did not divide into ordinary days. It divided into a long season of light and a long season of dark. In summer, the sun refused to leave, wheeling low and endless around the sky, and the shallows shone through the small hours. In winter it refused to come, and the coast sank into weeks of deep twilight and darkness. Cold and quiet, the water black under a sky with almost no sun in it at all. Feel what that would do to a life. For part of the year, the wetlands were generous and bright, food everywhere. The strange, sourceless daylight never fully fading. A bird could feed at any hour. Then the balance tipped. The light thinned to that watery skim-milk paleness and finally drained away. The long dark closed in. Whatever Vegavis did to survive it, whether it moved or hunkered or waited out the cold on a coast lit only by the low glow at the horizon's edge, it lived a rhythm no temperate creature ever knows. Light, then dark, in long, slow tides. And through all of it, the sound of the place stayed simple. No song filled the winter dark because there was no song yet to fill it. In summer, when the light stretched long, the loudest voices along the shore would have been these flat honking calls, thrown between birds across the water. Sound carries strangely over cold, flat shallows. A nasal blare could travel a good distance, bouncing off the reeds, fading into the wind and the wash of the sea. That, not melody, was the music of the polar coast. Blunt, useful, and old. There is something almost tender in imagining why such a call would matter here. In a place of long light and long dark, in wetlands where sightlines vanish among the reeds, a carrying voice is a way to stay together, to find a mate, to signal alarm, to keep a small flock in contact across grey water when the eye alone cannot manage it. The honk of Vegavis was not decoration. It was a tool for holding a life together at the edge of the world, in a climate of extremes, near the end of an era that did not know it was ending. Let me return you to the fossil itself for a moment, because the improbability of it deserves one more slow look. Consider everything stacked against you knowing this bird had a voice at all. It had to die in the right place, be buried fast, escape the scavengers, and lie still. Its most delicate internal structure had to mineralize before it collapsed. The rock had to hold that shape through nearly 69 million years and the drift of a continent. Then, in 1993, someone had to walk that windswept ground, find it, and recognize what MLP 93I31 truly held. And even then, the syrinx was not obvious. It took careful study, described only in 2016, more than 2 decades after the skeleton came out of the cliff, for the vocal organ to be understood for what it was. The oldest voice box of its kind does not announce itself. It sits quietly inside the chest of a small bird, waiting for someone patient enough to look and equipped to read what the looking reveals. That patience is the real instrument here. It turned a fragile smear of ancient tissue into a fixed point in the history of sound. Because that is what Vegavis gives you, a fixed point. Before it, across the immense reach of the Mesozoic, the fossil record of the singing organ is empty. After it, in the living world, that organ is everywhere, in the throats of thousands of species filling every dawn with sound. The little Antarctic waterfowl stands at the hinge between those two conditions. It marks, as nearly as anything can, the moment the true avian voice enters the record of the earth. One bird, on one cold shore at the closing edge of the age of dinosaurs, and it did something else, quietly, that outlasted the giants. Vegavis belonged to the waterfowl line, the branch that leads to living ducks and geese. That branch was already present, already distinct, already honking along the polar shallows, while the great non-avian dinosaurs still ruled the continents to the north. When the end came, when the impact and its long aftermath swept most of that world away, in what feels, across deep time, like a single geological instant, lineages like this one carried through. The birds you hear today are the far descendants of survivors, like the little bird of Vega Island. So when you next hear geese cross a cold sky, low and nasal and unlovely, let the sound settle differently in you. That flat honking is not a lesser voice. It is, in a real sense, an ancient one, closer to the oldest calls the fossil record can show than any nightingale's song. The melody of the songbirds came later, a refinement layered on top of a much older, blunter way of making noise. The honk came first. It crossed a polar sea before the flowers of the modern world had fully spread. It is a voice with deep roots. Let the scene begin to loosen now, the way sleep loosens the grip of a long day. Take one slow, quiet breath, the kind that empties you a little, and let the island soften at its edges. The pale summer light lies flat on the shallows. The reeds move. The small bird floats out on the grey-green water, dipping its bill, throwing its doubled honk across the cold, and the sound fades into wind and distance the way it has for nearly 69 million years, unanswered by any song because no song has yet been born. Feel how far you have come to reach this quiet. From a voice box in an armoured throat, across continents and millions of years, to a syrinx 3-dimensional and impossible, preserved in a cliff at the bottom of the world. The trail of the singing organ ends here, in the middle Maastrichtian, on a shore that has since drifted under ice. There is nothing older to find. The fossils have shown you the last best evidence they hold about how the ancient world made sound, and about the late quiet arrival of true song. Let the coast pull back and grow small beneath you now. The reeds, the pale water, the floating bird, all shrinking into the long curve of a cooling world. The honk fades. The light thins toward its endless polar horizon. Somewhere north, the last great dinosaurs breathe in a soundscape without melody, and none of them know how little time is left. From here, the record of stone can carry you no further into their voices. Come south now to the far edge of the world as it stood roughly 69 million years ago. There is no ice here yet. The Antarctic Peninsula wears no white cap, holds no frozen shelf grinding at the sea. Instead, you stand on a low shoreline of cool temperate wetland, where shallow cold water meets a margin of reeds and soft mud. The night has been long because this is a polar country, and its darkness stretches for many hours in the season's turning. Now that darkness begins, very slowly, to thin, the light does not arrive the way it does in the tropics. There is no sudden edge, no quick gold flare over the horizon. Instead, the grey comes up gradually, spreading slow as milk pooling across a wide flat table, creeping outward until it touches the water and the mud and the standing stems. You feel the temperature more than you see the change. The air is raw and damp against your skin, cold enough to make you want to fold your arms, carrying the smell of brackish water, of decaying reed litter, of salt and cold silt turned over by the tide. Close to the waterline, tucked among the low vegetation, a small bird begins to stir. She's about the size of a modern duck, and in truth, she's a close cousin to the ducks and geese you already know. Her name, given long after her death, is Vegavis. She belongs here at the very end of the age of dinosaurs, one of the true birds already sharing this world with the great non-avian giants. She has slept with her head turned back along her body, bill tucked into the feathers of her shoulder, one leg drawn up beneath her. Now she lifts her head into the cold, and the first thing she does is nothing at all. She simply holds still and lets the slow light reach her. Watch her without hurrying. You have all the time this dawn will give you, and it gives its time generously here. She blinks. She shifts her weight from the folded leg. She stretches one wing out and down, spreading the feathers like a fan opened underwater, then draws it back. She works her bill through the feathers of her breast once, twice, setting the barbs back in order, pressing warmth and water-shedding oil along the vein of each feather. Every motion is small and unremarkable, and exactly the motion a water bird makes at dawn today. That continuity is part of what makes her real to you. She is not a monster. She's a bird waking beside cold water, tidying herself before the day. The tide has drawn back a little in the night, and it has left the mud exposed in a broad soft apron between the reeds and the shallows. She steps down onto it. Her feet are webbed, and they spread as they press into the silt, leaving shallow three-toed prints that fill slowly with dark water behind her. You can almost feel the cold of that mud yourself, the way it would grip a bare foot, the way it would give and then hold. She walks with the rolling, deliberate gait of a swimming bird brought onto land, unhurried, testing each step, her head bobbing gently to keep her balance and her eyes moving over the ground. At the edge of the shallows, she begins to feed. She lowers her bill to the surface and works it, straining the cold water and the loose surface mud, taking small, soft things you cannot quite see, seeds and tiny invertebrates, and whatever the tide has stranded overnight. The water is very cold. It would numb your hand within a minute. She does not seem to mind it at all. Her feathers hold a layer of warm air against her skin, and the cold slides off the oiled outer surface without ever reaching her. She dips and lifts and dips again, and the small sounds of her feeding carry a short way across the still surface before the quiet closes over them. She's not alone. Out across the water, half seen in the growing light, other shapes are moving, more of her own kind scattered along the wetland margin, each one waking into the same slow dawn. And now one of them lifts its head and calls. Here we must be careful and honest with you, because the honesty is part of the calm. No one has ever heard this sound. It was never recorded, and it never could be, for the animal died before any ear that could remember it existed to listen. What we have instead is a single extraordinary fossil. From this very region, from Vega Island, paleontologists recovered a Vegavis skeleton that preserved in 3 dimensions its syrinx. The syrinx is the vocal organ of a bird, the true source of birdsong, and this is the oldest one ever found, the only one known from the whole Mesozoic world. Julia Clark and her colleagues described it in 2016, and its shape is what lets us guess at the voice. The shape tells a specific story. The syrinx is asymmetrical, built not like a single simple pipe, but more like a natural double instrument, with structure that suggests 2 independent sources of sound, one on the left and one on the right. That is the same broad architecture you find in living waterfowl. And so the researchers made the careful, modest inference, not that Vegavis sang, but that it very likely honked, a nasal, braying, goose-like call, closer to the sound of a modern duck across a winter marsh than to any whistle or any trill. This is inference from anatomy and from living relatives. It is not a recording. Hold both of those things gently in your mind at once, the confidence and the uncertainty, and let neither one keep you awake. So imagine the sound the fossil permits. Across the water the first call goes up, and it is not musical. It is flat and nasal, and a little harsh, a honking bray thrown out over the cold surface. Then another bird answers, and another, until the calls are passing back and forth low over the water, skimming the surface the way a hand skimmed flat across cold glass would move, close and level and quick, barely lifting. The sound does not soar. It travels sideways across the shallows, from one waking shape to the next, and then it settles back into quiet. Your bird, the one at your feet, lifts her own head and adds her voice. You feel it almost more than you hear it, the small effort of it, the way her throat works and her body tenses for an instant. The call comes out nasal and short, a single blunt note, and then she lowers her head again to the water and goes back to feeding as though nothing had happened. Perhaps it was a contact call, a simple "here I am" thrown into the dawn to be answered. Perhaps it meant less than that. We cannot know the meaning. We can only know from the bone that the instrument to make such a sound was there inside her, and that its nearest living echoes are the honking birds of the modern marsh. Let the scene widen a little as the light keeps coming. The grey has warmed now toward a pale, low gold, though the sun still hangs close to the horizon and will climb only shallowly all day, this being a polar summer where the sun crawls along the rim of the world rather than mounting overhead. The reeds stand out from the water in sharper lines. Mist lies in low sheets over the colder pockets of the marsh and begins grudgingly to lift. The smell of the place strengthens with the warmth, that mingling of salt and mud and green rot and cold sea, the smell of a living shoreline that has never known frost the way this coast will one day know it. There are other lives here in the margins, though your bird pays them little attention. Somewhere out in the shallow cold sea, larger swimmers move through water thick with fish. Along the wetland the vegetation is low and dense, a cool temperate green rather than a tropical tangle, and through all of it runs the truth that gives this dawn its quiet weight. This is very nearly the end. Vegavis lived in the last few million years of the Cretaceous, in the final stretch before the great ending that closes the whole long age. She does not know that. She only knows the cold water and the soft mud and the answering honks of her own kind across the marsh. She feeds a while longer. The calls rise and fall around her, that flat nasal chorus passing low over the glassy shallows, and then thinning again as the birds settle to their morning. She works the water with her bill. She steps once more along the mud, leaving another set of shallow prints that fill and darken behind her. The light finishes its slow spread across the whole surface of the marsh, and the long day, such as it is, has begun. Everything you have just stood inside was reconstructed, gently and carefully, from a handful of hard evidence and a great deal of living comparison. The bones of Vegavis are real. The 3-dimensional syrinx is real, and so is its telling asymmetry. The rest, the honk itself, the meaning of the call, the exact texture of that dawn chorus over the cold Antarctic water, is inference laid patiently over the fossil, drawn from the ducks and geese that carry that same instrument in their throats today. The bone can tell you the shape of the voice. It cannot play the voice back. If the fossils fall silent here, the only voices left to guide you belong to the animals still breathing today. If the fossils fall silent here, the only voices left to guide you belong to the animals still breathing today. There are two of them, in a way. Birds on one branch of the family, crocodiles and alligators on the other. Together they bracket every extinct dinosaur that ever lived. Think of two bookends holding a long shelf of volumes you can never open. The tyrannosaurs, the sauropods, the armored ankylosaurs, all of them sit somewhere on that shelf between the two living ends. And so the paleontologist does a slow, patient thing. She studies the animal still breathing at either end. Then she asks what the silent middle most likely shared with them both. This is why a cassowary and an alligator have become, in their strange way, the two best instruments we have. Not because either one is a dinosaur in disguise, neither is, but each preserves a working piece of the ancestral machinery, and when the same trick shows up on both ends of the bracket, the odds rise that the middle carried it too. Keep that image with you as you drift. A bird on one side, a crocodile on the other, and a long, patient inference stretched between them like a wire. Start with the birds, and with something they do that you have almost certainly heard without noticing. Not song, not the whistle of a thrush or the chatter of a starling. Something lower and stranger made with the mouth closed. A dove sitting on a wire, throat swelling, producing a coo that seems to come from inside its whole body. That is closed-mouth vocalization. The beak stays shut. Air is not expelled into the open sky. Instead, it is shunted into an elastic pouch in the throat, or the esophagus, and the pouch swells, and the whole inflated chamber trembles like the skin of a drum. What comes out is a boom, or a coo, or a low-pulsing hum. You do not so much hear it as feel it arrive. In 2016, a team led by Tobias Reed looked at how often birds do this, and the answer was surprising. Closed-mouth vocalization has evolved independently at least 16 separate times within birds. 16! It is not one inherited quirk passed down a single line. It is a solution that living birds keep reinventing over and over in lineage after lineage. And when the researchers ran that pattern back down the family tree, they estimated the probability that the last common ancestor of all archosaurs used closed-mouth vocalization at about 0.42. Not a certainty, not even a majority. But close to a coin flip, and that is a striking number for a behaviour that leaves no bones behind. There are two more details from that study worth holding on to in the dark. The first is a size rule. Closed-mouth calling is only used by birds roughly dove-sized or larger. Below that, the trick seems not to work. The body is simply too small to move air the way the method demands, and nearly every non-avian dinosaur you can name was far, far larger than a dove. The second detail is about pitch. Sealing the mouth and resonating through an inflated pouch biases the sound downward toward low frequencies and away from the bright, wide-ranging calls an open beak can make. So the method itself has a voice. It is deep. It is quiet in the way that thunder is quiet, felt before it is heard. Now cross to a living bird that takes this method to its extreme, and does so at a body size that starts to feel dinosaurian. The cassowary. A flightless bird of the New Guinea and northern Australian rainforest, standing up to 6 feet tall, with a helmet of keratin on its skull and a stare that gives nothing away. You will not often hear a cassowary, but when you do, you may feel it first in your chest. In 2003, Andrew Mack and Josh Jones measured those calls and found components reaching down to about 32 Hz in the southern cassowary and down to roughly 23 Hz in the smaller dwarf cassowary. That is at the very floor of human hearing, and in places beneath it. Sound so low it stops being a note and becomes a pressure. Watch how the bird makes it. The cassowary tilts its head toward the ground. Its whole body begins to shudder, not the throat alone, but the entire trunk, as though the animal has become a single tuned membrane. The researchers describe the body itself acting as a resonating amplifier. The bird is not blowing a note through a pipe. It is vibrating like a struck bell made of muscle and hollow bone, and the sound that leaves it travels low and long through the dense understory, under the leaves, beneath the birdsong, carrying to another cassowary that may be a quarter-mile away and out of sight. Here is the sensation, if you want to stand inside it. Imagine laying your palm flat against a heavy shut door while, on the other side, something enormous hums. You do not hear the hum through the wood so much as feel it push back against your open hand. That is the register a booming cassowary lives in, a sound that arrives in the breastbone like a palm laid flat against a closed door. Now scale the animal up. Not 6 feet, but 30. Not 100 pounds, but tens of thousands. If a modern bird the size of a person can shake the forest floor at 23 hertz, the low end available to a resonating hadrosaur, standing 3 or 4 times taller, becomes something you feel in your teeth from across a valley. Cross the bracket now, from the feathered end to the scaled one, and the same deep language repeats in a different mouth, the American alligator. On a spring morning in a southern swamp, a large male lifts his head and arches his back, and before the sound you can name even begins, the water itself answers. His bellow is preceded by infrasound, vibration below the threshold of your hearing, and that infrasound pours off his back into the water above it. The surface breaks into a fine, jittering spray, droplets dancing upward off nothing you can see, as though the pond were simmering. Then the audible bellow rolls out across the water, and it goes on, and it means several things at once. One of those meanings is measured and honest. When Stefan Ribert and colleagues studied these bellows, they found that the spacing of the formants, the resonant frequency bands shaped by the size of the animal's vocal tract, reliably signals body size. A larger alligator has a longer resonating cavity, and a longer cavity spaces its formants closer together, and any listening alligator can read that spacing the way you might read the depth of a voice in the dark. It is an acoustic ruler. The sound cannot easily lie about how big the body behind it is. A small alligator cannot fake the formants of a giant, because the formants are set by anatomy, not by effort. This is the kind of thing paleontologists notice. If the honesty of body size signalling is built into the crocodilian end of the bracket, it may well have run through the middle, through animals for whom size was everything. And there is the sensation again, felt rather than heard. Stand near a large waterfall and you know it before you round the last bend, because the ground under your feet is already trembling, a low continuous tremor with no single source. Infrasound from a bellowing archosaur moves through the earth in much the same way. It travels through the soil and the standing water and up through the soles of whatever is nearby, a tremor with no clear direction, arriving in the body before it registers in the ear. This is the physical texture of the world these animals most likely lived inside. Not a place of sharp cracking roars, a place of deep pressure and long low rolling, carried as much through ground and water as through open air. So the living laboratory gives you a coherent picture. On both ends of the bracket, in the birds and in the crocodilians, the deepest and most far-reaching sounds are low, resonant and often made with a closed or nearly closed mouth. Booms, coos, bellows, hums you feel in the sternum. It is from that shared foundation, and not from a lion at the zoo, that the honest reconstruction of dinosaur voices is built. But honesty means admitting where the wire between the bookends goes slack, where the living relatives stop answering and the arguments begin. There are several such places, and a calm mind can hold them all at once without needing any of them resolved tonight. Let the debates come slowly, one at a time, like weather moving across a plain you're watching from very far away. The first argument is the loudest, and it is about a tail. Late in the 19th century of our own reckoning it would have seemed absurd, but the modern version begins with a serious engineering question. Could the long, tapering, whip-thin tail of a diplodocid sauropod like a Parasaurolophus luzei be swung fast enough to break the sound barrier at its tip? In 1997, Nathan Myhrvold and Philip Curry built a computer model of the tail's dynamics and argued that it could. The tail narrows from a base as thick as a tree trunk to a final segment as fine as a bootlace, and a fast coordinated wave running down the taper could, in their model, drive the very tip past the speed of sound. In 2015 they unveiled a physical stand-in, a steel and aluminum tail about 12 feet long, and when it was swung the tip reached roughly 1,181 feet per second, faster than sound, and the air answered with a bullwhip crack. On camera it snapped, the loudest noise ever seriously proposed for any dinosaur. Sit with how strange that idea is before you weigh it. Not a call meant to carry warmth or warning to another of its kind, but a percussive detonation, a display or a threat written in a single, supersonic pop that might have echoed across a Jurassic floodplain. It is a seductive picture, and it may be wrong. Because a real tail is not steel and aluminum, it is bone and cartilage and ligament and skin and the soft tissue that binds one vertebrate to the next. In 2022, a biomechanical study bearing the blunt title Multibody Analysis and Soft Tissue Strength refutes supersonic dinosaur tail argued that the models had left out exactly the thing that matters most. Put the soft connectors back between the vertebrae, the study reasoned, and the forces required to reach supersonic speed would tear the living tail apart long before the tip ever broke the sound barrier. Kenneth Carpenter and others have pressed the same point. The whip that cracks so cleanly in steel would, in flesh, simply come apart. The debate is not settled. One camp measures a real tip breaking the sound barrier in metal. The other camp models a real tail of tissue failing under the strain. Both are careful. Neither has the last word. So the supersonic sauropod stays where it belongs for now, filed under open question, a crack that may or may not have ever sounded across the deep past. The second argument is quieter, and it lives inside a nose. When you first heard that some armoured dinosaurs carried astonishing convolutions in their snouts, looping, corkscrewing nasal passages far longer than a straight airway would need to be, it was tempting to hear a musical instrument. Surely, the thought goes, all that coiled, tubing-shaped sound. Surely those were resonators, built to give an ankylosaur a voice. It is a reasonable guess. It also appears, on the best current evidence, to be mostly wrong, or at least unproven. In 2018, Jason Bork and colleagues ran CT scans and computational fluid dynamics through the nasal passages of ankylosaurs like Panoplosaurus and Euoplocephalus, and simulated air actually moving through those coils. What they found was not primarily an acoustic function, it was a thermal one. The convoluted airways worked as remarkably efficient heat exchangers. As the animal breathed in, the long folded path warmed the incoming air by a striking margin, on the order of 32 degrees Fahrenheit in models, with the great majority of that warming, about 94%, happening in the nasal vestibule before the air ever reached the lungs. Picture cold dawn air entering an ankylosaur's snout and leaving that maze of tubing already close to body temperature, the animal conserving its own heat and moisture with every breath. The coils are a radiator, not obviously a horn. That does not slam the door on resonance entirely. A structure can serve more than one purpose, and warmed air still passes over tissues that might, in life, have shaped a low sound. But the honest statement is this. The one dedicated study built to test what those nasal mazes were for found heat exchange, clearly and measurably, and found no comparable evidence that resonance was their point. So when someone tells you they know exactly what an ankylosaur's nose sounded like, you may let the claim pass by without alarm. The nose kept the animal warm. Whether it also gave the animal a voice remains gently unknown. The third argument is not about making sound at all. It is about receiving it. What could these animals actually hear? Here the evidence hides inside the skull, in the delicate coiled structure of the inner ear, and specifically in the length of a fine strip of tissue called the basilar membrane, whose proportions track the range of frequencies an animal is tuned to detect. Soft membranes do not fossilize, but the bony canal that houses them sometimes does, and its dimensions can be measured from CT scans and compared across living and extinct archosaurs. From that comparison comes a careful inference. Large-bodied dinosaurs, the tyrannosaurs and the giants among them, appear to have had inner ears well suited to low-frequency sound, and possibly to infrasound, the register beneath human hearing where elephants and alligators do their long-distance signalling. Notice how neatly this closes the loop, and notice too that it is inference, not recording. If the biggest dinosaurs were built to hear low, then a world full of low booms and infrasonic rumbles is a world in which they were listening carefully. The ears and the voices fit each other, sender and receiver tuned to the same deep band. But no one has recorded a Tyrannosaurus hearing test. No larynx, no syrinx, no scrap of vocal tissue survives for the animal Hollywood made loudest. What survives is the shape of the ear canal and the shape of the relatives, and a chain of reasoning that says with real care that this creature most likely lived in a low register, both in what it heard and, by every reasonable extension, in what it said. That reasoning is honest precisely because it stops short of the roar. Let all three debates settle in your mind at their own weight, none of them forced. The sauropod tail may or may not have cracked. The ankylosaur nose warmed air and may or may not have also shaped sound. The great predators were likely tuned to the deep end, though no recording will ever confirm it. Uncertainty is not the same as ignorance. It is the shape of knowledge that is still being carved, and there is something restful in watching it stay honest, in hearing a science that says we do not yet know rather than pretending it does. And when you gather everything the living laboratory and the fossils actually support, and set it beside what the movies gave you, the contrast is quiet and total. The evidence points, again and again, toward booms and coos, toward hisses and bellows, toward low rumbles you would feel in the ground before you heard them in the air. Closed-mouth resonance on both ends of the bracket, whole bodies vibrating like drums, formants that honestly carry the size of the animal across water and open ground. Inner ears built to catch the lowest notes in the world. Every one of those is grounded in a named study, a measured frequency, a scanned bone. The lion-throated roar, by contrast, rests on nothing but a mixing board and the wish for a monster. Booms, coos, hisses, and rumbles are simply far better supported than any sound a film has ever put in a dinosaur's mouth. That is not the story of a disappointment. It is the story of a truer world, deeper and stranger than the invented one, so let the invented one go. Let the borrowed elephant and tiger and killer whale slip out of the picture, and do not mourn them. In their place, imagine the real thing settling over an evening at the end of deep time, a herd of long-crested hadrosaurs calling low across a floodplain as the light drops, a cassowary deep hum passing between two armoured giants you cannot see through the ferns. Somewhere near the water, an infrasonic pulse rolling out and setting the surface trembling, felt by every listening ear for a mile in the failing warmth. None of it sharp, none of it sudden, all of it low and patient and enormous, a soundscape you would sense in your chest before your ears ever caught up. The great roar you were promised is not there. What is there is better, because it is real, or as close to real as careful people can honestly reach. Pull back now, slowly, up and away from the swamp and the floodplain, and the coiled nose warming the dawn air, until the individual animals become dark shapes on a wide plain, and their calls become a single low murmur under the sky. The evidence rests. The debates keep their open doors, and the sound of the deep past as best we can know it is not the thing that was sold to you. Picture the tale first before anyone argue about it. At the hips it began thick as a tree trunk. Then it tapered, vertebra by vertebra for 40 feet or more, growing thinner the whole way. By the tip it was slender, almost delicate, a strand of bone and muscle no wider than a rope. This was the tail of a Parasaurolophus lewisii, a diplodocid sauropod of the late Jurassic. And two researchers once wondered what would happen if a tail like that were swung hard. Their names were Nathan Myhrvold and Philip Curry. In 1997, in the journal Paleobiology, they published a paper with a question mark in its title. Supersonic sauropods, it asked. They built a computer model of the diplodocid tail. They treated it as a long chain of segments, each one lighter and quicker than the segment behind it. When they set the heavy base swinging, something odd happened out at the far end. The motion travelled down the tail like a wave. It gathered speed as it went. You have felt a smaller version of this yourself. Flick a wet towel from your wrist and the loose end leaps forward faster than your hand ever moved. The energy crowds into the lightest, farthest part and arrives there as a snap. Now imagine that same trick performed by an animal longer than a school bus. The model suggested the tail tip might reach roughly 1,181 feet per second. That is around 800 miles an hour. Faster than sound itself. That last detail is the whole point, so sit with it a moment. When any object pushes past the speed of sound, it leaves behind a small shock, a sharp report in the air. That crack you hear from a bullwhip is exactly this. The whip is not striking anything. Its tip is simply breaking the sound barrier, and the boom is the air closing back over the gap. Myhrvold and Curry proposed that a sauropod could do the same with the end of its tail. Not a strike, a crack, thrown across the Jurassic floodplain. In 2015 they went further and built the thing, a physical tail about 12 feet long, made from steel and aluminum. A simplified stand-in, tapering the way the real bones taper, jointed so it could flex. They swung it and they filmed it with high-speed cameras. On camera, the model tip crossed the speed of sound. It cracked, audibly, like a bullwhip snapped in a quiet room. If the number holds, it would be the loudest sound ever proposed for any dinosaur. Not a voice at all, but a signal. A display, perhaps, or a warning, or a way for one giant to announce itself to another across the open ground. It is a beautiful idea. And this is the moment to slow down, because a beautiful idea is exactly the kind that deserves a second, harder look. The steel model is not a tail. That is the heart of the objection. Kenneth Carpenter, a paleontologist who has spent decades with sauropod skeletons, pointed out what the metal leaves out. A living tail is not a bare string of vertebrae swinging free. It is wrapped in ligaments that lash the bones together. It is bound by tendons, sheathed in muscle, wrapped again in thick skin. All of that tissue does something the steel and aluminum did not. It stiffens the tail. It resists the very whipping motion the model depends on. Think about what the supersonic crack actually requires. The tip has to travel faster than a rifle-slow bullet while the rest of the tail lags behind. That means enormous strain concentrated in the thinnest, most fragile section. In a bare mechanical model, the joints simply take it. In a real animal, the critics argue, the connective tissue between those small tail bones would reach its breaking point first. The tail would not crack. It would tear. In 2022, that argument was given numbers. A study in Scientific Reports carried a blunt title. Multibody analysis and soft tissue strength refute supersonic dinosaur tail. The team built their own model, but they added what the earlier work had set aside. They gave the joints realistic limits. They asked how much force the ligaments and tendons of a real sauropod could bear before failing. Then they drove the tail towards supersonic speed and watched where it broke. Their conclusion was that the tissue gives out long before the tip reaches the speed of sound. The forces needed to accelerate that slender end so violently simply exceed what a living tail could hold together. So now you have two careful models pointing in opposite directions. It would be easy to want a winner here. Let the wanting go and look instead at what each side can honestly show. The first side can show that the geometry allows it. A long, tapering, many-jointed tail is in principle a whip. Set one swinging in a computer or in steel, and the tip can indeed pass the speed of sound. That much is real. What that side cannot show is a living Apatosaurus doing it. No fossil preserves the act. No metal model can prove that flesh and ligament behaved like flesh and ligament, because the metal has neither. The second side can show that tissue has limits, and that those limits are easy to overlook when you swing a bare frame. What that side cannot fully show is the exact strength of a ligament in an animal dead for 150 million years. They estimate it, carefully, from living relatives and from the bones themselves. But they too are building a model of a thing no one can measure directly. Both camps are reasoning from replicas toward an animal that will never be tested again. And so the tail crack sits where honest questions sit, unresolved, not disproven and not confirmed. A striking possibility with a serious objection standing beside it, neither one able to close the case. You are allowed to find that unsatisfying. You are also allowed to find it restful in its way, because it is what the truth actually looks like before it is forced into a shape. This is worth holding on to because the tale is not alone. Almost everything about ancient sound lives in this same open country. The hadrosaur crest modelled as a resonating pipe, revised as the scans improved. The ankylosaur voice box read as bird-like from a single young specimen. The nasal mazes that might have shaped a call, or might have only warmed the air. In each case, the careful answer is a range, not a note. The people doing this work tend to say so plainly. They publish the objection alongside the claim. They let a rival study refute them in print and keep the question open on purpose. That habit is the quiet strength of the whole field. It would be simple to hand you a single confident sound and let you fall asleep believing it. It would also be false. The steel tail cracking on camera is a real experiment, and the soft tissue simulation tearing that same tail apart is a real experiment, and both were done by serious people who wanted to know. What they have given you is not a dinosaur's voice. It is the shape of a good argument still going, with the evidence honestly on the table. So let the loudest possibility fade to a maybe. Let the supersonic crack hang there, half believed, a boom that may have rolled across the Jurassic or may have only ever lived inside a model. Set it down gently beside all the other sounds you cannot quite have. The bellows and the coos, the hisses, the deep rumbles felt through the ground more than heard. So you are left with booms and coos and low-rolling thunder, and a silence where the roar used to be. So you're left with booms and coos and low-rolling thunder, and a silence where the roar used to be. Let that silence stay for a moment. It is not empty. It is only honest. And now the view begins to lift, slowly, the way a warm current lifts a leaf off the floor of a river. Watch the individual animals grow small beneath you. The juvenile Pinacosaurus with its tiny fossil voice box, specimen Aegem 103 on H6, laid in the sand at Ukar Tolgod. The Parasaurolophus with its 4.5-foot crest of looping tubes. The duck-sized Vegavis wading a cool Antarctic shore near the very end of the Cretaceous. One by one they settle back into the landscapes that held them. You do not lose them. You simply stop leaning so close. The camera keeps rising. The San Juan Basin spreads out below, a warm monsoon floodplain of conifers and ferns along slow brown rivers. Somewhere in that green, a hadrosaur tips its head and pushes air through its crest. You cannot hear it as a certainty. You hear it as a model, a low resonating moan built from 350 slices of fossil bone at Sandia in 1997, then revised again with more inner chambers by Hongjun Lin in 2024. The sound drifts across the ferns and thins into the humid air, higher now. The Gobi dune fields turn to a pale ribbon far to the north and west. The Antarctic coast becomes a thin bright edge, where cool water meets a land that is not yet ice. From this height the separate worlds begin to join. They were never really separate. They were all one long slow age of the Earth, the Mesozoic, laid down in patient layers of rock that you're now floating above. Hold on to the honesty as you climb, because it is the kindest thing here. Nobody recorded these voices. No microphone waited in the Cretaceous. Every sound in this story is a careful inference, drawn from bone geometry, from a single preserved larynx, from the living cousins that bracket the extinct ones, the crocodiles below and the birds above, the cassowary booming at 23 hertz, the alligator whose bellow ripples the water on its back. These are the instruments scientists play to guess at a music that has been gone for 66 million years. And that is enough. That is more than we once had. A generation grew up certain that a tyrannosaur roared, when the truth is that we have never found its throat at all. What we can honestly offer is quieter and stranger, and in its own way more beautiful. A world tuned low, a world of rumble and hum. So let the imagined chorus resolve now, as the camera pulls back over the whole sweep of deep time. Let the sharp edges soften. What rises from the continents below is not a scream. It is a broad, low weather of sound, booms that travel like distant surf. Coos passed between a parent and its young, long infrasonic rolls that move under the range of your own hearing, the way an elephant speaks to another elephant across miles of grass. Feel how much of it would be felt rather than heard. A closed-mouth boom is a body event. The throat pouch swells, the chest shudders. The call goes down into the ground and travels through the soles of the feet of every animal standing near. If you could stand on that Cretaceous floodplain, you would feel a hadrosaur before you understood you were hearing one. A pressure in the breastbone, a tremor in the sand. Now the floodplains blur together, the coasts blur together. Individual calls lose their outlines and become a single low resonance laid over the whole Mesozoic world, the sound of many large calm animals breathing and signalling across 100 million years. It carries over water, it carries over open ground, it settles into the valleys the way fog settles, filling the low places first. You are very high now. High enough that the herds are only movements in the green, and the rivers are silver threads, and the great crested heads are too small to see. The sound reaches you only as a suggestion, a warmth at the edge of perception, and then not even that. This is where the years begin to fall. Watch them come down, soft and countless, like fine pale dust. Each grain 1,000 years, each drift 1,000,000, deep time settling over everything below, over the floodplains and the dune fields and the cool bright coasts, until the settling reaches you too. Imagine it drifting down onto the back of your resting hand, so light you cannot feel a single grain land, only the slow gathering weight of all of them together. That is what 100 million years feels like, not a blow, a gentle accumulation you never notice arriving. The layers thicken, the floodplain becomes stone, the dune field becomes stone, the little Antarctic shore becomes stone, and the ice comes later to sit on top of it. The voices are folded down into the rock with everything else, not lost, only held, waiting for a CT scanner and a patient scientist and a question asked out loud. Let your breathing follow the camera down toward stillness. There is nothing left to solve tonight. The debates can wait. Whether the sauropod tail truly cracked, whether the crests were for sound or for show, whether the ankylosaur nose sang or only warmed the air. None of it needs an answer before you sleep. It will all still be there in the morning, argued gently in journals, patient as the rock. Take one slow deep breath, and let the ancient world grow quiet beneath you. The last low call is going to soften, and then it is going to thin, and then it is simply going to fade away into the long dark that holds all of deep time. The camera lifts one final time. The continents draw together and drift apart in silence. The seas rise and fall. The green ages come and go, the Triassic, the Jurassic, the Cretaceous, each one a single soft breath of the planet. From here you cannot hear any of it. You can only see the light moving over a world that kept its own counsel, and never once needed us to hear it. Let it go now. Let the herd settle in their warm flood plains. Let the little bird on the Antarctic shore fold its wings. Let the armoured juvenile rest in the sand with its small throat intact, keeping the one true voice box we were ever lucky enough to find. The dust of years keeps drifting down, quiet and even, over all of them and over you. It asks nothing. It only settles. and under it the honest soundscape rests. The booms and the coos and the low rolling thunder, no roar among them, and no roar needed. You are far above it all now, warm and unhurried, watching the dark come up soft around the edges of 100 million years. There is nothing more to reach for. There is nothing more to name. The last resonance has gone down into the stone, and the stone is patient, and the night is long, and you are exactly where you should be. Rest here. Let the deep time settle over you like the finest dust, weightless and complete. Let the ancient world keep its quiet. Let the low calls you will never truly hear carry on across their floodplains without you, the way they always did, the way they always would. Sleep well tonight, traveller. Good night.